The word came from someone who had been inside the household, not a tabloid source, not a disgruntled former employee conducting a press campaign for compensation or attention, someone who had worked in the specific proximity that royal service requires, the daily, close, professionally intimate proximity of a person whose job is to make another person's life function, and who had emerged from that proximity with a single word that they used, privately and with the specific weight of someone who has chosen their word carefully, to describe what the experience had been. Merciless. Not difficult, not demanding, not the kind of description that gets applied to any high-achieving person who holds their staff to exacting standards and does not apologize for doing so. Merciless, a word that implies something about the absence of the quality whose absence it names, the absence of mercy, of the ordinary human softening that most people apply to their dealings with other people, not out of weakness but out of the recognition that the people they are dealing with are people, with limits and vulnerabilities, and the ordinary human need to be treated as something more than a function to be performed. The word was applied to Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, the second child and only daughter of Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, the woman who has served the institution for over 5 decades with a professionalism that the official account consistently describes as among the most admirable in the modern royal family, the hardest working, the least interested in public attention, the most straightforwardly committed to the charitable work that is the public-facing dimension of the royal role. The official account is not false. Anne's commitment to her public work is documented and real and consistently attested by the people who have worked alongside her in the charitable context, the Save the Children, the equestrian world, the institutional affiliations that she has maintained with a consistency that puts most of her family's record to shame. The work is genuine, the commitment is genuine, the professionalism is genuine. What the official account does not contain is the word that came from inside the household. The word that the people who had been in close professional proximity to Anne across the decades of her public life used in private to describe the experience of that proximity. The word that the palace's management apparatus had spent decades ensuring did not reach the mainstream press in any form that required official engagement. The women who worked for Princess Anne, and who were the specific recipients of the quality the word describes, they are the subject of this account, not as a group with shared identity or shared grievance or shared strategy. As individual women, each with their own story and their own specific experience of what it meant to work in close proximity to the Princess Royal, and each with their own experience of what happened after the proximity ended. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What happened after the proximity ended for many of them was not what the official story of royal service suggests should happen. The official story describes service as an honor, a period of proximity to the institution conducted with professional discretion that enriches the professional record and provides the kind of experience that opens subsequent doors. The reality for a number of the women who left Anne's household across the decades was different from the official story in ways that the NDAs and the settlements and the managed departures the palace organized had been specifically designed to conceal. The concealment worked, as palace concealment operations tend to work, thoroughly in the mainstream record, incompletely in the private knowledge of the world that the household existed within. The private knowledge accumulated across the decades in the way that private knowledge always accumulates around a sustained pattern of behavior, through the conversations of people who had been present, through the networks of royal service that connect households and carry information between them, through the occasional semi-public account that reached the edges of the official information environment without breaking through to the mainstream. The pattern is what this account is about, not a single incident. Not a specific confrontation or a specific departure or a specific woman whose story is dramatic enough to stand alone as the subject of an account. The pattern, the sustained, consistent, across decades pattern of a specific kind of treatment directed at the people who worked most closely with Princess Anne, and the institutional management of the consequences of that treatment, and the specific cost to the women who bore it. The cost was real. It was not always financial, though in some cases financial settlements were part of the management of departures that had generated the kind of complaints the palace could not absorb without management. It was not always visible in the immediately obvious sense of a career that ended or a life that was dramatically altered. The cost was often quieter than that. The specific, persistent quality of damage that close exposure to a certain kind of treatment produces in people who were not protected from it and who had no recourse against it. The word covers it. Merciless. The women who worked for Princess Anne and who bore what the word describes know what it cost them. Some of them are still living with it. This is their account, assembled from the incomplete and semi-attributed sources that the management apparatus could not entirely prevent from reaching the record, into a picture of what the word meant, and where it came from, and why the palace worked so hard for so long to ensure it stayed inside the household rather than traveling beyond it. It traveled anyway, not far enough, not loudly enough, not in the form that would have required the institution to account for it publicly, but far enough to be here. Far enough to be said. There is a specific kind of invisibility that powerful women acquire when the institution around them decides that their story is less useful than the story of someone else. Diana was the story, Charles and Camilla were the story, William and Kate were the story. Harry and Meghan became the story in the specific way that departures from institutions always become stories, through the drama of the leaving, the public account of what the leaving was about, the sustained attention that follows anyone who walks away from something the public had invested in. Anne was never the story, not in the way the others were. She was always in the background of the story, the sensible one, the working one, the royal who got on with it without generating the kind of material that the tabloid press and the documentary makers and the biographers who write books about the Windsor family require to sustain the attention of their audiences. She was the royal who was respected without being particularly known, who was covered without being examined, who existed in the public consciousness as a reliable presence at ceremonial occasions and in equestrian contexts, rather than as a person whose inner life and private behavior were subjects of public curiosity. This invisibility was partly chosen and partly managed and partly the product of genuine temperament. Anne did not seek public attention. She found the press intrusive in ways she expressed, occasionally with the directness that is among her most consistent public characteristics. She gave few interviews, and what interviews she gave were controlled in the specific way that royal interviews are always controlled. The access granted on terms that ensured the management of the encounter rather than the genuine revelation of the person. She wore the invisibility like a preference rather than a constraint. The management apparatus found the invisibility convenient. An Anne who was not the story was an Anne whose private behavior did not generate the kind of public scrutiny that the behavior of more prominent royals generated. The machinery that existed to manage information about the royal family expended its primary resources on the principles of the major narratives: Diana in the 1980s and 1990s, William and Kate in the 2010s, Harry and Meghan in the period that followed. Anne was a secondary management concern, not unmanaged. The management apparatus covered the entire family, and Anne's household was within its scope, but secondary in the allocation of the resources and the attention that the apparatus deployed. The secondariness of the management effort contributed to the incompleteness of the suppression. The information about Diana's marriage required the palace's most aggressive and most sustained management operation, because Diana herself was actively working against the suppression and because the public appetite for the information was at its maximum. The information about Anne's household required less aggressive management, because Anne was not the story and the public appetite for information about her was correspondingly lower. The lower management effort produced a less complete suppression. The information exists in the semi-public record in a form that is more available than the information about Diana's marriage is available, precisely because it did not generate the kind of maximum effort suppression that Diana's situation produced. The semi-public record on Anne's household is where this account begins, not with dramatic revelations or direct testimony from named sources. With the accumulated pattern of what exists in the semi-public record, the accounts that reached the edges of the mainstream press without breaking through to the mainstream, the descriptions of the household's atmosphere from people who had been inside it, the specific quality of information about a sustained pattern of behavior that the management apparatus had managed out of the mainstream without fully eliminating from the world. The public Anne is a well-established figure. She has been photographed at more royal engagements than almost any other member of the family across the 5+ decades of her public life. She has been present at every major ceremony, every significant family occasion, every institutional event that the Windsor family's year produces. She has been covered by every major British newspaper and photographed by every major royal photographer and written about in every significant account of the modern monarchy, and yet she is not known in the sense that known implies access to the interior. The official account describes the surface with considerable thoroughness, the work ethic, the directness, the equestrian achievements, the no-nonsense manner that the press has always positioned as admirable contrast to the more managed presentations of other family members. The surface is described and photographed and documented with the same thoroughness that the official account applies to all senior royals. What is not described is what exists behind the surface, the private person, the person that the women who worked in close proximity to her experienced across the decades of their service, the person that the word describes. Understanding why the person behind the surface has not been engaged with in any sustained public account requires understanding something about how Anne's public image was constructed and maintained across the decades of her public life. The construction began early. Anne was the second child and the only daughter, born in August 1950, less than 3 years after her brother Charles. The specific position she occupied in the family, not the heir, not the spare, the daughter in a family whose institutional logic placed sons above daughters and whose emotional geography was dominated first by the preparation of the heir and then by the arrival of 2 further sons in the 1960s, shaped her formation in ways that have not been fully examined in the official accounts of the family. The not the heir position had specific consequences. It removed from Anne the specific burden of preparation for the throne, the constant institutional attention to Charles, the cultivation of his public image, the management of his education and his relationships and his every public appearance in terms of their implications for the eventual kingship, and it gave her instead a different kind of freedom and a different kind of constraint. The freedom was the freedom of someone who was not the primary institutional investment, who could within limits exist as something closer to a person rather than a role. The constraint was the constraint of someone who was expected to fulfill the institutional requirements of royal life without being given the full institutional resources that the heir's position came with. The combination produced something specific. Anne grew up in a household where Philip was the dominant emotional presence and where Philip's specific formation, the demanding expectations, the comfort with high standards, the preference for self-sufficiency over warmth, shaped the emotional environment that all 4 children absorbed. Charles absorbed it in the way this account's preceding installment described, with the specific vulnerability of a sensitive child who needed more than the formation provided. Anne absorbed it differently. She absorbed it as identity. The demanding standards, the self-sufficiency, the preference for competence over sentiment, these became in Anne not the constraints against which she chafed but the values she held. She became in important respects the most Philip-like of Philip's children, the most clearly marked by the specific formation he provided, the most comfortable with the specific way of being in the world that his formation represented. This is not a criticism. Philip's formation produced genuine qualities in Anne that are among her most consistently admirable characteristics. The work ethic is real, the directness is real, the refusal of self-pity and the comfort with difficulty and the specific kind of resilience that the equestrian world both requires and rewards. These are real and they are the product of a formation that asked a great deal and provided the tools to meet the asking. What the formation did not produce, or produced in insufficient quantity, was the specific capacity for mercy, for the ordinary human softening in the treatment of people who are less capable or less resilient or less able to meet the high standards that the formation made feel like the natural expectation. Philip had this deficit too, in the specific way this account's preceding installment described, the impatience with weakness, the sharpness that emerged when expectations were not met, the preference for the expression of high standards over the expression of unconditional warmth. In Philip, the deficit was managed by his social intelligence, the specific ability to read rooms and people, and the contexts in which the sharpness was and was not appropriate, which modulated the expression of the deficit in ways that made it manageable in the public record even when it was visible in the private one. In Anne, the deficit appears to have been less modulated by social intelligence of this kind, or modulated differently, in ways that made its expression in the context of the household, the specific context of close professional relationships with women who were dependent on the household for their professional standing, more direct and more sustained and more costly to the people on the receiving end of it. The public account never engaged with this. The public Anne was the Anne that the surface described, hard-working, direct, no-nonsense, admirable in her commitment to the role. The private Anne, the Anne that the household experienced, the Anne that the word describes, was managed out of the public account with the efficiency that the palace applied to all information it considered potentially damaging to a senior royal. The efficiency was sufficient to prevent the information from reaching the mainstream record in any form that required official engagement. It was not sufficient to prevent it from existing in the private knowledge of the world that the household inhabited, the world of royal service, the aristocratic social world, the network of people whose professional lives brought them into contact with the household, and whose private knowledge of it was more complete than the official account permitted. That private knowledge is the foundation of what follows. Not the proof that the legal standard requires, not the directly attributed testimony of named sources making specific claims, the accumulated pattern, the semi-public accounts, the described atmosphere, the consistent characterization from multiple independent sources of a household that produced in the women who passed through it a specific kind of experience that the word covers, assembled into a picture that the mainstream record does not contain, and that the management apparatus spent decades ensuring did not reach the mainstream. The picture exists. The word exists. The women who bore what the word describes exist, some still living, some not, all marked in ways that the official account of their service to the Princess Royal does not acknowledge. This account acknowledges it. That is the beginning. The question of how a person becomes who they are is always more complicated than the answer that gets offered most readily. The ready answer for Anne is the institution. She was born into it, formed by it, shaped by its requirements from the moment she was old enough to understand that the family she had been born into was not like other families, and that the difference imposed specific things on the people inside it. The institution produced her in this reading, in the way that institutions produce people who grow up entirely inside them, through the absorption of its values, the internalization of its requirements, the gradual formation of a self that corresponds to what the institution needs rather than what the person, in some pre-institutional state, might naturally have been. This reading is partially accurate and significantly incomplete. The institution shaped Anne. It did not make her alone. The making involved something more specific and more personal than the general institutional environment. It involved Philip. The Philip-Anne relationship is the most under-examined significant relationship in the modern Windsor family's private history. It has been examined in the biographies and the documentaries and the various retrospective accounts of the family, but examined in a way that tends toward the surface, the shared equestrian passion, the temperamental similarities, the general observation that Anne is more Philip's child than any of the others. The surface examination does not engage with what the relationship actually produced in Anne, what Philip's specific formation applied to a daughter rather than a son, produced in the specific context of the Windsor household in the 1950s and 1960s. The context matters. Philip's relationship with Charles, the elder son, the heir, the boy who would be king, was shaped by the institutional weight of what Charles represented. The expectations Philip brought to Charles were shaped by the institutional requirements of the role Charles would occupy, which were demanding in the specific way that the preparation for kingship is demanding, and which produced the specific dynamic this account's preceding installment described. The father whose expression of love was through demanding expectation rather than unconditional warmth, applied to a son who needed the warmth more than the expectation. The relationship with Anne was differently shaped. Anne was not the heir. The institutional weight that shaped Philip's engagement with Charles was not present in the same form in his engagement with Anne. What was present was something more purely personal, the specific way that Philip engaged with a child who was temperamentally closer to him than Charles was, who met the high expectations with the resilience rather than the sensitivity that Charles brought to them, who gave Philip back the reflection of his own formation that Charles's different temperament did not provide. Philip liked Anne in a way that the accounts of people who observed the family in private settings consistently register. not the qualified, complicated, effortful liking that characterized the father-son relationship, the liking that had to be maintained against the friction of mismatched temperaments and mismatched needs. The straightforward liking of someone who recognizes in another person the qualities they most value, and who finds the recognition pleasurable in the uncomplicated way that genuine recognition tends to be. Anne was capable. She was physically brave in ways that the equestrian world made visible from early in her life. The specific courage of someone who gets back on the horse after the fall, not because they are required to, but because the getting back on is simply what you do, and the failure to do it would be a form of self-betrayal that is more uncomfortable than the fall itself. She was direct in the way that Philip was direct, the saying of what she thought without the social padding that most people apply to the expression of opinions they believe might be unwelcome. She was self-sufficient in the way that Philip was self-sufficient, not seeking the validation of others for the assessments she had made of herself, not requiring the affirmation that Charles required and that Philip was constitutionally unable to provide. These qualities delighted Philip. They were the qualities his formation had produced in himself and that he had come to understand as the correct qualities for navigating the specific world he and Anne both inhabited, the world of the royal family and the public role and the demands that both imposed. Charles's sensitivity and his need for warmth were, from Philip's perspective, vulnerabilities, qualities that would make the role harder rather than easier, that required management rather than expression. Anne's self-sufficiency was the opposite, a strength, something to be built on rather than managed around. The building on produced something. In Anne, it produced the specific combination of qualities that the official account has always described as her defining characteristics: the work ethic, the directness, the resilience, the no-nonsense manner. These are real. They came from somewhere real. They came from a formation that valued them, that reinforced them, that communicated to Anne through the specific quality of Philip's engagement with her versus his engagement with Charles, that these were the qualities that earned the kind of response she valued from the person whose response she most valued. What the building on also produced, and this is the dimension the official account does not engage with, was a specific relationship to the people around her who did not have these qualities, who were less capable, less direct, less self-sufficient, who needed more warmth than the formation valued, more softening than the formation provided, more of the ordinary human accommodation that the formation had taught Anne was not the correct way to be in the world. Philip's formation had produced in him a deficit in this accommodation. It expressed itself in the famous sharpness, the impatience, the occasional cruelty of the public gaffes and the private demands. The social intelligence Philip possessed modulated the expression of this deficit in certain contexts. He could read when the sharpness was and was not appropriate, could adjust for audiences that required different treatment, could turn the directness into something that read as bracing rather than brutal in the contexts where that adjustment was available. Anne absorbed the deficit along with everything else the formation provided. The accommodation of people who were less capable or less resilient than the formation's standard, the softening of expectations, the recognition that the standard was not universally achievable and that the failure to achieve it did not constitute a moral failure, was not something the formation taught as valuable, and it did not become part of Anne's character in the way that the qualities the formation did teach became part of her character. The absorption of the deficit was not her failure, it was the formation's product. A child who is formed in an environment that does not model a specific quality will not automatically develop that quality, will have to develop it, if they develop it at all, through conscious effort against the grain of the formation rather than through the natural expression of what the formation produced. The effort may or may not happen depending on the specific circumstances and relationships and experiences that the adult life provides. The institution did not encourage the effort. The institution that Anne inhabited as an adult, the royal family's institutional structure, the household she ran, the world of royal service and its specific power relationships, was not an institution that provided the conditions for the development of the accommodation the formation had not produced. It was an institution that reinforced the formation rather than correcting it, that provided Anne with a staff whose position made them dependent on her approval, and whose dependency created the specific conditions in which the deficit, expressed without the modulation that a more balanced power relationship might have imposed, produced the experiences that the word describes. The institutional product is the dimension the official account does engage with, in the specific way that official accounts engage with the dimensions of their subjects that serve the institutional narrative. Anne is presented as the product of a formation that gave her the qualities the institution values most: the work ethic, the commitment, the directness, and those qualities are presented as the explanation for the public Anne in a way that is accurate as far as it goes. What the official account does not do is follow the formation to its full conclusion, to the qualities it produced alongside the admirable ones, to the deficit alongside the assets, to the specific character of a woman who was formed to be capable and direct and self-sufficient, and who was not formed to accommodate the people around her who could not meet the standards the formation had established as correct. That full conclusion is the private Anne. The Anne that the household experienced, the Anne that the word describes. The formation is not a justification. The understanding of where something came from does not constitute an endorsement of what it produced. Philip's formation and what it produced in Anne explains the deficit. It does not excuse its expression in the treatment of the women who worked for her and who bore the cost of a formation that had not equipped the person it produced to treat the people around her with the ordinary human mercy that the word's absence names. The formation produced a specific person. The person ran a specific household. The household produced specific experiences in the women who served in it. The experiences produced specific costs that the women carried after the service ended. The costs are what matter. The formation is the context for the costs. Understanding the context does not reduce the costs or the responsibility of the institution that managed those costs into invisibility rather than acknowledging them. The institution produced Anne. The institution managed the consequences of what it had produced. The management served the institution's interests in ways that did not serve the interests of the women who bore the costs. This is the pattern. It begins with the formation. It ends for the women in the places this account will describe. Those places are not where royal service is supposed to end. They are where it ended for these women. The formation is why. The institution's management of the formation's consequences is the other why. Both are part of the account. Neither is sufficient alone. Together they describe something that the official version of Princess Anne has always required to stay outside the mainstream record. It has stayed there long enough. Royal households do not assemble themselves. They are built carefully and with considerable institutional attention, through a process that reflects both the requirements of the role and the specific preferences of the royal person the household will serve. The building involves the palace's administrative apparatus, the senior courtiers and private secretaries whose institutional knowledge shapes the initial structure, and the individual judgment of the royal for whom the structure is being built, whose preferences and working style determine the specific character of the household that the structure produces. Anne's household took its initial form in the late 1960s and early 1970s as she moved through her late teens and into her early 20s, and the public role began to make the institutional requirements of a formal household structure necessary. The formation of the household coincided with the period of Anne's life in which her public identity was being established: the equestrian success, the 1976 Olympic appearance, the specific public profile that the press had begun to construct around the combination of her riding achievement and her direct manner, and the general impression she gave of someone who was not performing for the cameras but was simply getting on with whatever she was doing regardless of whether the cameras were present. The early household was small. The scale of a royal household is calibrated to the scale of the public role, and Anne's public role in the late 1960s and early 1970s was not yet the full, extensive program of engagements that it would become in later decades. The staff were few in number, and their functions were the standard functions of a junior royal's household: the private secretary, the lady-in-waiting, the personal protection officers, the domestic staff whose roles were common to all royal residences. The women who occupied the lady-in-waiting position in the early household were drawn from the specific social pool that has always provided ladies-in-waiting to senior female royals: the aristocratic and upper gentry world, the daughters and wives of families with long connections to the court, the women whose social formation made them suitable for the specific requirements of the role in the terms that the institution had always applied to those requirements. They were not employees in the conventional sense of the word. Their position was understood as an honor honor, a form of service that carried social prestige rather than significant financial compensation, and that operated according to the social code of the world from which they came rather than the employment law framework that governed ordinary working relationships. The social code of the lady-in-waiting relationship is old and specific. It predates employment law entirely and has never been fully absorbed into the legal framework that governs most working relationships in contemporary Britain. The lady-in-waiting serves the royal she is attached to with a form of loyalty that is closer to personal commitment than professional obligation. She is present because she has been chosen, because the choosing is an acknowledgement of her standing in the world, and because the relationship between a royal and her ladies-in-waiting is understood as a personal relationship rather than an employment relationship, even when it involves the performance of specific functions that would constitute employment in any civilian context. This structural ambiguity, the relationship's simultaneous quality as personal and professional, as honor and obligation, is one of the most significant features of the early household for understanding what happened within it. A woman who occupies the lady-in-waiting position is not an employee who can assert the rights that employment law provides. She is a companion in the institutional sense, whose position depends on the royal's continued satisfaction with her service, and whose departure, if it comes, is managed as a personal matter rather than an employment matter. The management of departure as a personal matter rather than an employment matter means that the institutional frameworks that protect employees from arbitrary or unfair treatment, the grievance procedures, the employment tribunals, the legal protections against constructive dismissal and harassment, are not available to ladies-in-waiting in the way they are available to ordinary employees. Their protection is the social code of the world they come from, which values discretion and loyalty above almost everything, and which provides its own form of management for departures that are difficult, through the aristocratic network, through the mutual understanding of a small world that closes ranks around its members in ways that civilian employment networks cannot replicate. The protection the social code provided was real, in the sense that the world Anne and her ladies-in-waiting shared was sufficiently close and sufficiently interconnected that extreme forms of mistreatment would have generated social consequences for Anne within the world she inhabited. But the protection was limited and partial in ways that became more significant as the pattern this account describes developed. Limited because the social code's primary mechanism is the management of the surface rather than the acknowledgement of the substance. Partial because the code's primary loyalty was to the institution rather than to the individuals who served it. The first women who served in Anne's early household experienced the household in the specific way of people who were present at the formation of an atmosphere rather than the inheritors of one already established. The atmosphere was not yet fixed. The patterns that would become consistent and then documented and then the subject of the management operation this account describes were forming rather than formed. The women who came first were inside the formation of the atmosphere rather than the full expression of it. What they experienced in those early years is less completely available in the semi-public record than what the later staff experienced, for reasons that include the simple passage of time. The women who served in the early household are older than those who came later, and some of them are no longer living, which reduces the available pool of testimony even in the indirect forms that the semi-public record relies on. The social code of the world they came from also applies with particular force to the women who served in the closest proximity to the household's formation. They are more likely to be the women whose belonging in the aristocratic world is most dependent on the code's maintenance, whose departure from the code would be most costly in the terms the code itself applies. What the early household established in its initial years was the working culture that would persist and intensify across the decades of the household's operation. The working culture had the specific character that Philip's formation had produced in Anne, demanding in its expectations, direct in its communication, not particularly patient with the failure to meet the expectations or the discomfort that the directness produced in the people it was directed toward. The directness was experienced differently by different women in the early household, depending on their specific temperament and their specific relationship to the social code that governed the world they all shared. Some women, formed by the same code and sharing the same values around self-sufficiency and the acceptance of high standards without complaint, absorbed the directness as the normal working condition of a demanding employer and continued in their service without particular difficulty. These women are part of the story too. Their presence in the household across sustained periods is part of the evidence that the atmosphere was not universally and uniformly damaging, that the specific women who bore the worst of what the word describes were not random but were somehow specifically in the line of the expression. Other women experienced the directness differently. The women who needed more accommodation than the formation produced, who were more sensitive to the specific quality of the communication in ways that the formation did not value or provide for, who found the working culture of the household more costly to sustain than the social code permitted them to acknowledge, these women began to leave in the early years with a frequency that the household's small size and the aristocratic social world's discretion kept below the threshold of notice that would have generated external attention. The frequency of departures is the first visible sign of the pattern. In a household of the size and the type that Anne's early household represented, staff turnover at the level of the senior positions, the ladies-in-waiting, the private secretaries, is expected to be low. These are positions occupied by women who have been selected for their suitability, who have undergone the institutional assessment that the palace applies to appointments at this level, and who have committed to a form of service that is understood as sustained rather than temporary. A high rate of departure from these positions in any royal household is the kind of pattern that generates attention in the world of royal service, the world of private secretaries and courtiers, and the network of people whose professional lives involve proximity to the royal family, and who carry, in that proximity, detailed knowledge of the specific atmosphere of each of the households they have contact with. The attention was generated, not publicly. The world of royal service is not a world in which attention to institutional problems produces public statements or press coverage. The attention was internal, carried in the private knowledge of the people whose professional world included awareness of Anne's household, expressed in the oblique language of a world that knows what it knows and says it in terms that maintain plausible deniability while communicating the substance to people with sufficient context to receive it. The attention did not produce intervention. The institutional framework around royal households is not designed for intervention in the way that civilian employment frameworks are designed for it. The mechanisms that exist for the management of problems in royal households are managed by the palace's administrative apparatus, which operates with the institutional priority of maintaining the surface rather than addressing the substance, and which approaches the management of difficult situations in royal households with the same toolkit it applies to all difficult situations: containment, management of the information environment, the organized departure of the people whose continued presence would require more active management of the situation. The organized departures are the most significant feature of the early household's record, not the departures themselves. Departures from royal service happen for many reasons and do not individually constitute evidence of a pattern. The organization of them, the specific way that the palace managed the departures that were most potentially problematic, the arrangements made with departing staff about what they would and would not say after leaving, the packages and understandings and managed silences that accompanied the more difficult departures, is what describes the pattern rather than the individual events. The organization left traces, not in the official record. The official record contains only the appointments and the public acknowledgements of service, the anodyne statements about staff transitions that the palace's communications operation produces as the public-facing representation of what happened. In the semi-public record, the knowledge of the royal service world, the occasional account that reached the edges of the mainstream without breaking through, the specific quality of silence that surrounds the subject of Anne's household in contexts where the social code and the professional code together produce the specific not saying that is its own form of communication. The early household established the culture. The culture persisted. The departures accumulated. The pattern became established as a feature of the household rather than a collection of individual events. The women who came first experienced the formation of the pattern. The women who came later experienced the pattern already formed, the working culture already established, the expectations already fixed, the specific expression of what the formation had produced in Anne already normalized within the household in ways that made it harder rather than easier to identify as something that exceeded the ordinary demands of a demanding employer. The normalization is the most dangerous feature of an established working culture. Once a specific way of treating people has become the normal condition of a household, it loses the visible unusualness that might otherwise have generated the kind of external attention that could have produced intervention. The women who entered the household in its later years entered a culture that presented itself as simply how things were, as the standard that the Princess Royal maintained and that her staff were expected to meet, rather than as something that departed from what service to a senior royal should be. They entered the culture, they experienced it, they bore what it required them to bear, and then, in the various ways that this account will describe in subsequent parts, they left, carrying what the culture had given them into the lives that followed the service, finding in those lives the specific evidence of whether what they had experienced was something they could absorb without lasting cost or something that the absorption had cost them more than the service had acknowledged. The early household is where the cost began. It is the foundation of everything that followed. The women who built their service on that foundation did not always know, when they entered it, what the foundation was made of. They learned. The learning was the cost. Words chosen carefully by people who have experienced something directly carry a different weight from words chosen by people describing something they have observed from a distance. The distance version of Anne's private behavior has been available in various forms across the decades of her public life. The press has always known that Anne was demanding. The world of royal service has always known that her household had a specific working culture. The social world that intersects with the aristocratic milieu in which the household existed has always held, in its private knowledge, a version of what the household was like that was more complete than the public account. None of these versions produced the word. The word came from proximity, from someone who had been inside the household in the specific daily closeness that the lady-in-waiting or the senior personal staff role requires, the role that involves being present not just at the public engagements and the official functions but in the private spaces, the unmanaged moments, the specific hours of a day when the performance is not required and the person is simply themselves, operating in the environment they have constructed around themselves without the modulation that public visibility imposes. What the proximity produced in this specific person was not a long account, not the detailed testimony of someone who had decided to make their experience public and who had organized it into the narrative form that a formal disclosure requires. A single word, chosen after the experience had been processed and assessed and reduced to its essential quality, offered privately to someone trusted in a context that the speaker believed was not going to reach the public record. Merciless. The word has a specific etymology that is worth sitting with for a moment, because the etymology illuminates what the word does that alternatives do not do. Mercy, from the Latin misericordia, the compassion that is extended to the suffering, is the quality that a person with power exercises toward a person with less power in ways that soften the exercise of that power. It is the recognition in a person who has the capacity to harm or to impose cost on another person that the other person is a person, with limits, with vulnerabilities, with the ordinary human need to be treated with the consideration that the recognition of their personhood requires. The absence of mercy, mercilessness, is not cruelty in the dramatic sense. It does not require the intention to harm. It does not require the awareness of harm being done. It requires only the absence of the recognition, the consistent failure to register that the person in front of you has the ordinary human limits that would, if registered, produce some adjustment in how they are treated. The merciless person is not necessarily malicious. They may be entirely indifferent to harm, rather than actively pursuing it. The indifference is the thing the word names, the specific quality of someone who does not consider, or does not consider with sufficient weight, the cost that their behavior imposes on the people around them. In the context of a royal household and a principal whose position gives them near total institutional authority over the people who serve them, mercilessness has specific and predictable effects. The power asymmetry in a royal household is more extreme than in most civilian employment relationships. The staff are dependent on the royals' approval for their position, which is their livelihood, and, in the case of the ladies-in-waiting drawn from the aristocratic world, their social standing. The royals' capacity to impose costs, through the expression of displeasure, through the withdrawal of warmth or acknowledgement, through the specific quality of treatment that communicates to a person that they are failing to meet the standard, is extensive and largely unchecked by the institutional frameworks that moderate the power of employers in civilian contexts. In this context, the consistent absence of the recognition that the people in the household have ordinary human limits, that they will sometimes fall short of the standard, that the falling short does not constitute a moral failure, that the response to the falling short should include something of the accommodation that mercy provides, produces a specific kind of working environment, an environment in which the staff are under continuous pressure to meet standards that are not calibrated to their actual capacity, in which the failure to meet those standards is experienced as a personal condemnation rather than a workable situation, and in which the absence of the ordinary human softening that most workplaces provide through the normal operation of relationships between people means that the experience of the pressure is unrelieved by anything. The people who described Anne's household in these terms, in the oblique, carefully hedged terms of the semi-public record, were consistent in the specific character of what they described. Not the dramatic incidents of explicit cruelty or specific named confrontations that a more dramatic account would produce, something more persistent and more pervasive than that, the quality of the daily working environment, the specific atmosphere of a household in which the principal's expectations were communicated in ways that left no room for the ordinary human accommodation that makes sustained professional relationships bearable. The directness was part of it. Anne's directness is well documented in the public account. The press has always noted it, usually in the admiring terms of someone describing a quality they find refreshing in a world where managed communication is the norm. The directness is real, and it is in certain contexts genuinely admirable. The willingness to say what one thinks without the social padding that most people apply to the expression of potentially unwelcome views is a quality that the people who deal with Anne in public and semi-public contexts consistently describe as, at minimum, interesting and at maximum, one of her most engaging characteristics. In the household, the directness operated differently. The difference is the difference between directness exercised in a relationship of relative equality, where both parties have the standing to respond, to push back, to say their own thing directly in return, and directness exercised in a relationship of extreme power asymmetry, where the person receiving the direct communication has neither the standing to respond directly nor the institutional protection to absorb the communication without cost. Directness in a relationship of extreme power asymmetry is not simply directness, it is the communication of a judgment without the social modulation that a more equal relationship would require, by a person whose position gives them the authority to make the judgment without accountability and whose judgment, received by a person who has no effective recourse, carries the full weight of its content without the softening that ordinary social exchange provides. When the judgment is negative, when the directness is the direct communication of displeasure, of failing to meet the standard, of inadequacy in some dimension of the service being performed, the effect on the person receiving it is proportional to the power asymmetry in the relationship and to the frequency with which the communication is delivered. A single instance of direct negative feedback in any relationship is manageable and often useful. The consistent pattern of it, in a relationship where the recipient has no standing to respond and no protection from the accumulation of its effect, is what produces the specific kind of working environment that the word describes. The consistency is what the accounts from multiple sources, across multiple periods of the household's operation describe. Not isolated incidents, not the specific confrontation or the single event that can be named and dated and assessed independently. The consistent quality of a working environment in which the experience of the staff was shaped, daily and without relief, by the absence of the recognition that they were people rather than functions to be performed. The women who bore this experienced it in the specific ways that the general description allows for. The accounts describe working days in which the principal's communication of displeasure, communicated through the directness that the official account describes as admirable, arrived without the ordinary social signals that allow a person to prepare for negative feedback and to receive it without losing their footing, without the warning that most people provide, consciously or unconsciously, when they are about to say something difficult. Without the subsequent acknowledgement, once the difficult thing has been said, that the relationship continues and the person receiving the feedback is not irreparably diminished by it. The absence of the warning and the absence of the subsequent acknowledgement are the specific features that distinguish mercilessness from demanding. A demanding employer communicates high expectations and responds to the failure to meet them with the directness that the communication of standards requires. A merciless employer communicates high expectations and responds to the failure to meet them without the recognition that the failure is a workable situation in a relationship between people, rather than a judgment on the person's fundamental adequacy. The distinction sounds subtle, For the people inside the relationship, it was not subtle. It was the difference between a working environment that was difficult and a working environment that was, over time and with accumulation, damaging. The women who bore the most of what the word describes were the women who were most directly and most continuously in the principal's presence, the ladies-in-waiting whose role required them to be physically present with Anne across the widest range of contexts, including the private and unmanaged ones where the modulation of the public appearance was not required. They were the women for whom the working environment was most continuously experienced without relief, who spent the most hours in the most direct proximity to what the word describes, and who had the least institutional distance from it. The word came from someone who had been in this position, someone who had spent enough time in the specific proximity to accumulate the experience that the word summarizes. Someone who had processed the experience and arrived at the assessment that the word represents, not in anger, not as the expression of a grievance that had not been resolved, but in the plain language of someone describing a thing they had experienced with sufficient clarity to name it. Merciless. The word is not the full account, it is the summary of the full account, the reduction to its essential quality of an experience that had detail and specificity and the individual texture that any sustained experience has. The detail and the specificity are what the subsequent parts of this account will attempt to reconstruct from the available sources, in the semi-public record and the private knowledge of the world that the household existed within, but the word is the foundation. It is where the account begins, not with a formal allegation or a documented incident or a named source making a specific claim, with a word chosen carefully by someone who had been there. The word describes something real. The something real had effects. The effects are what this account is about. The word is why. Patterns in institutional behavior do not announce themselves. They develop gradually, through the accumulation of individual instances that each seem in isolation like unremarkable events. The ordinary friction of a demanding workplace, the normal difficulty of a challenging employer, the kind of working environment that the people inside it absorb as the condition of the role rather than as something that requires examination or naming. The pattern only becomes visible when the instances have accumulated enough that someone steps back from the individual events and looks at what they collectively describe. In Anne's household, the pattern became visible to the people inside the world of royal service who were positioned to observe it through the accumulation of departures. Not any single departure, not any specific incident that generated external attention, but the frequency and the character of the departures across the decades of the household's operation. The frequency was higher than the norm for a royal household of comparable size and type. The character of the departures, the specific way they were managed, the arrangements that accompanied the more difficult ones, the quality of silence that surrounded them in the semi-public record, was the character of departures that required management rather than the character of ordinary staff transitions. Understanding the pattern requires understanding how it began, because the beginning shapes everything that follows. Patterns in how people treat other people do not typically arrive fully formed. They develop through the specific mechanism by which formations express themselves in environments that do not adequately check their expression, through the gradual confirmation that the expression produces no consequences sufficient to alter the behavior, and through the consequent reinforcement of the behavior that the absence of consequences provides. The beginning, in Anne's household, was probably not dramatic. The formation this account described in the preceding part had produced specific qualities in Anne: the directness, the demanding expectations, the specific relationship to people who fell short of those expectations. In the early years of the household, those qualities expressed themselves in a working environment that was demanding and direct, and not particularly patient with the failure to meet the standard, not yet merciless in the full sense of the word. The early version of the household's atmosphere was probably closer to what the official account has always described, demanding certainly, but within the range of what a senior royal's household might reasonably be expected to be. The escalation happened through a specific mechanism. The mechanism is familiar from the analysis of institutional cultures that have developed beyond healthy difficulty into something more damaging: the absence of feedback. Not the absence of negative feedback. The household provided that in abundance. The absence of feedback to the principal about the effect of their behavior on the people around them. The absence of the information that would have allowed Anne to understand that the working environment she was creating was producing costs in the women who were bearing it that exceeded what the demands of the role required. In a civilian employment relationship, the feedback mechanisms are institutional, grievance procedures, HR departments, employment law and its protections, which create the conditions for the communication of feedback that the employer may not want to receive but that the legal framework requires them to engage with. The institutional mechanisms do not always work perfectly. Grievance procedures are often managed by the same institutional culture that produced the problem, but their existence creates at least the structural possibility of feedback reaching the person whose behavior requires it. In a royal household, the feedback mechanisms are different and considerably weaker. The institutional framework that a civilian employer operates within does not apply in the same way. The palace's administrative apparatus, the senior courtiers and private secretaries who are, in theory, the people who would provide the feedback that Anne's household required, operates with the institutional priority of maintaining the relationship between the palace's administrative structure and the senior royals it serves. That priority is not compatible with the provision of sustained critical feedback to a senior royal about their private behavior toward their staff. The feedback, in other words, either did not reach Anne in any form that engaged with what was happening in the household, or it reached her in the managed, indirect, heavily softened form that the institutional culture of the palace produces when it attempts to communicate uncomfortable information upward. Either way, whether Anne received no feedback or received it in a form that did not effectively communicate the substance, the absence of effective feedback produced the condition in which the escalation was possible. The escalation moved through specific stages that the semi-public record describes consistently across multiple accounts. The first stage is the establishment of the standard, the communication of expectations that are high and non-negotiable, the creation of a working environment in which the standard is the primary reference point for all interactions between the principal and her staff. This stage is the one most easily confused with healthy demanding behavior, because high standards in themselves are not problematic, and the communication of high standards is not inherently damaging. The problematic element is present but not yet dominant. It is the absence of the accommodation that makes high standards workable over time, which has not yet become visible in its full effect because the accumulation that reveals it has not yet occurred. The second stage is the narrowing. The working environment narrows around the failure to meet the standard in ways that produce an atmosphere of continuous correction. The daily experience of being managed toward the standard through the consistent communication of the distance between where the staff member is and where the standard requires them to be. The narrowing is not a single dramatic moment. It is the cumulative effect of a pattern of communication that never acknowledges what has been done well, that moves immediately from any positive dimension of the work to the dimension that fell short, that communicates to the person receiving it that the distance from the standard is the permanent condition of their performance rather than a correctable gap. The specific quality of the narrowing, as it is described in the accounts from Anne's household, was the absence of acknowledgement. Not the specific acknowledgement of individual successes, the particular positive feedback that most people understand as the necessary counterpart of negative feedback. The more fundamental acknowledgement that the staff member's effort was seen and registered as effort, that the service was noticed as service, that the person performing it was recognized as a person who was giving something of themselves in the performing, rather than simply a function that was executing at a level that was either satisfactory or not. The absence of this acknowledgement is one of the specific things that the accounts of Anne's household consistently describe. The work was done, the standard was met, often at considerable personal cost in terms of the effort required to meet it. And the meeting of the standard produced not the acknowledgement that the meeting was sufficient, but the immediate identification of the dimension in which the meeting was incomplete. The communication was not, "This was done well and this needs improvement." It was, "This needs improvement." The first part of the sentence was consistently absent. Over time, the absence of the first part of the sentence produces a specific psychological effect in the person who is receiving only the second part. It produces the experience of never being adequate, of existing in a permanent deficit relative to the standard, regardless of the effort invested in closing the gap. This experience, sustained over the weeks and months and years of continued service, is what the accounts from the household describe as the core of what made the working environment costly to inhabit. The third stage, the stage that moves the pattern from difficult to what the word describes, is the point at which the expression becomes personal. The transition from the communication of high standards about work to the communication of negative judgment about the person doing the work. The transition is not always explicit. It is often made through tone, through the specific quality of how the communication is delivered, rather than the literal content of what is said. But the transition is legible to the person on the receiving end, who registers the shift from the demanding employer who is communicating high expectations to something else, something that feels in the receiving like judgment about their fundamental adequacy rather than feedback about their work. This transition and its effect on the women who experienced it is what the accounts from the household describe with the most consistency and the most emotional weight. The transition from difficult to merciless. The specific moment, not a single moment, but a quality of accumulated experience that eventually crosses a threshold at which the environment stops being a place where high standards can be met with sufficient effort and becomes a place in which the standard has become a vehicle for something else. For the communication of a judgment about the person that the person has no standing to contest and no recourse to challenge. The ending, the point at which a specific woman's service in the household concluded, followed a pattern in its organization that is itself significant. The departures were not left to the natural attrition of completed service or personal decision. They were managed. The palace's administrative apparatus was involved in the management of departures that had generated the kind of difficulty, the complaints, the breakdowns, the specific situations that required more active management than a simple transition, that required its involvement. The management of the departures took forms that the available accounts describe consistently. The arrangements made with departing staff about what they would and would not say after leaving. The financial components of the management, the settlements, the packages, the specific financial arrangements that accompanied the more difficult departures, the NDAs that formalized the silence that the management required, converting what had been a social code obligation into a legal one. The NDAs are significant not just as instruments of silence but as evidence of the palace's assessment of the situation. NDAs are deployed when the institution calculates that the departing person has information whose public disclosure would be damaging, and that the information requires a legal instrument rather than a social code obligation to contain. The deployment of NDAs against departing staff from a senior royal's household is the palace's formal acknowledgement, expressed through the legal form that acknowledgement takes in these circumstances, that the departures were not ordinary staff transitions, and that what the departing staff knew required managed rather than simply expected silence. The pattern, beginning, escalation, ending, repeated across the decades of the household's operation. New staff arrived, experienced the culture the early staff had established, found the culture as it found them, some able to sustain themselves within it through the combination of temperament and the social code's management of its costs, others less able, accumulating the experience that the word summarizes until the accumulation produced the departure that the palace then managed into the silence of the NDA. The repetition of the pattern across multiple individuals across multiple decades is the clearest evidence of its institutional character. Single incidents are personal. Repeated patterns across sustained periods and multiple individuals are institutional. The palace's management of the departures did not address the institutional character of the pattern, did not produce the feedback mechanism that might have altered the behavior that produced the pattern. It managed the consequences of the pattern without engaging with the pattern itself. The management protected the surface. The pattern continued beneath it. The women who entered the household in the years after the pattern was established entered it without the full knowledge of what the pattern was, because the management apparatus had ensured that what previous staff had experienced was contained in the managed silence of their departures, rather than available as information that might have informed new arrivals' assessment of what they were entering. They entered, they experienced. The pattern which was already formed and which the absence of effective feedback had reinforced and the management of departures had protected from external challenge, expressed itself on them with the consistency that established patterns expressed themselves on new recipients. They bore it. Some of them bore it for longer than others. None of them, when they arrived, knew exactly what the bearing would cost. They found out. The finding out is the subject of what follows. The household had male staff. This is worth stating plainly before anything else, because the account that follows focuses on the women, and it is important to establish that the focus is not arbitrary, not the result of a decision to tell a particular kind of story rather than the whole story, but the result of what the available accounts consistently describe. The available accounts consistently describe the women as the primary bearers of the pattern this account has been describing. Not the only people affected by the working culture of the household, the male staff, the protection officers, the private secretaries and equerries whose roles brought them into sustained proximity with Anne's working style, were inside the same culture and were shaped by it in ways that their own accounts, such as they are in the semi-public record, confirm. But the specific character of the worst of what the word describes, the most sustained, the most personal, the most costly, was directed primarily at the women, and the women were the ones who bore it most completely and who left the household most marked by the bearing. Understanding why requires understanding something about how Anne's relationship to the women around her worked, and what the specific quality of that relationship was in ways that distinguished it from her relationship to the male staff who occupied the same institutional proximity. The distinction begins with the social position of the women in the household. The ladies-in-waiting and the senior female personal staff occupied a specific position in the social architecture of a royal woman's household that the male staff did not occupy. They were companions in the institutional sense, present not just as the performers of specific functions but as the social context of the principal's private life, the people whose company constituted the female world that surrounded Anne in the hours and days when the public role was not being performed. The companion role is different from the functional role. A protection officer performs a specific function, the physical protection of the principal, and the relationship between the principal and the protection officer is shaped primarily by the function rather than by the social proximity that the function requires. The companion performs a function too, but the function is constituted by the social relationship itself, by the quality of presence and conversation and shared experience that the companion provides. The companion is not background staff. She is the foreground of the principal's private social world. This specific proximity, the presence in the foreground of the private social world rather than the background of the functional support structure, meant that the women in Anne's household were exposed to the principal in a different and more complete way than the male staff who occupied more functionally defined positions. They were present for the full range of the principal's moods and communications and interactions, including the dimensions that the functional staff's more defined role protected them from. They were the people toward whom the directness was most frequently directed, the people whose performance was most continuously assessed, the people in whose presence the absence of the accommodation that the word names was most consistently and most immediately experienced. The proximity also meant that the women were the people whose departure, when it came, was most managed and most carefully silenced. The protection officer who leaves a principal's household carries specific operational knowledge, the security arrangements, the routes, the protocols that requires management on grounds of security. The lady-in-waiting who leaves carries something different and in some ways more sensitive, the social knowledge. The knowledge of the principal's private behavior, private moods, private communication style, the specific quality of the private person that the companion's proximity makes available. The management of the lady-in-waiting's departure was driven, at least in part, by the management of the social knowledge she carried. But there is something else, something deeper than the structural explanation that the available accounts suggest was at work in the specific character of what the women experienced. Something about the specific quality of Anne's relationship to the women around her that produced in that relationship the most consistent expression of the pattern. The accounts describe something that functions like a specific dynamic between Anne and the women who served her most closely, a dynamic in which the women's proximity and their social role as companions produced, rather than protective warmth, a specific intensification of the critical attention that the pattern in general involved, as if the companion's role, the role that was defined by personal closeness rather than functional distance, meant that the women were seen more completely than the male staff were seen, and that being seen more completely by someone whose seeing did not include the mercy that seeing usually requires meant being exposed to a more complete version of the critical assessment. This dynamic is not unique to Anne's household. It is a recognizable pattern in the relationships between powerful women and the women who serve them. The specific way that female-on-female workplace dynamics can produce a more personalized and more penetrating form of critical attention than the dynamics between powerful women and their male staff tend to produce. The reasons for this are complex and contested, and this account does not attempt a full analysis of them, but the pattern is described consistently enough in the accounts of Anne's household that its presence is not deniable. The women were seen. They were seen in ways that went beyond the assessment of their functional performance into the assessment of their persons. The directness that the formation had produced in Anne expressed itself in the companion relationship as a form of personal scrutiny. The consistent, unsparing attention to the ways in which the women around her fell short, not just in the performance of their duties but in the wider sense of being the people they were. The specific forms this scrutiny took, as they are described in the available accounts, ranged from the professional to the personal in ways that the distinction between the two categories could not fully contain. The professional criticism, the communication of failure to meet the standard in the specific duties the role required, was the primary form, but the accounts describe a quality of the communication that extended beyond the professional into something more personal. Comments about appearance, about manner, about the specific ways in which the women presented themselves in the principal's company that went beyond the requirements of the role into the territory of personal judgment. The personal judgment, delivered by someone whose institutional authority made it impossible to contest, in a relationship that was defined by closeness rather than functional distance, produced the specific effect that the semi-public record from multiple independent sources consistently describes: the experience of being continuously assessed and consistently found wanting, not as an employee whose performance is being evaluated, but as a person whose fundamental adequacy is being called into question. This specific effect, the experience of having one's fundamental adequacy called into question by someone whose judgment carries the weight of the institutional authority behind it, delivered in the intimate context of a companion relationship without the protection of the institutional frameworks that civilian employment provides, is the experience that the word summarizes. The mercilessness was not just the absence of accommodation for professional shortcomings. It was the absence of the recognition that the women around Anne were people whose fundamental adequacy was not the palace's business to adjudicate, and whose personhood was not available as the material for the kind of sustained personal scrutiny the companion relationship made possible. The women bore this in ways that varied with their specific temperament and their specific resources for bearing it. Some of them bore it with the stoicism that the social code of their world required, the code that said that service was service, that the requirements of royal households were what they were, that the appropriate response to difficulty was the management of the difficulty without complaint, rather than the acknowledgement that the difficulty was more than what the service required. The stoicism was real, and it was costly, and it was the form in which the social code extracted its price from the women who had been most completely formed by it. Others bore it less stoically, or bore the stoicism up to the point where the accumulation exceeded its capacity to contain what was being accumulated, and the bearing gave way to the departures that the palace then managed. The departures were not always voluntary in the conventional sense. The accounts describe women whose service ended in circumstances that were managed by the palace in ways that suggest the departure was at minimum strongly encouraged. The strong encouragement was the institutional form of acknowledging that the working relationship had reached the end of its sustainability without acknowledging why it had reached that end. The why is the pattern. The why is the word. The why is the specific character of a working environment that directed at the women who served in it the sustained, unmodulated critical attention of someone whose formation had not produced the recognition that people around her required a form of treatment that acknowledged their personhood alongside their professional function. The male staff were not exempt from the demanding working culture. The accounts of men who served in Anne's household describe a principal who was equally direct in her communication with them, equally clear in her expression of high expectations, equally impatient with the failure to meet those expectations. The directness was not gender-specific. What was different was the form the directness took and the context in which it was received. The male staff occupied more functionally defined positions in which the directness was more clearly calibrated to the professional dimension of the role, the assessment of whether the function was being performed at the required level. The personal dimension, the scrutiny of the person rather than the function, was less present in the accounts of male staff's experience than in the accounts of female staff's experience. The companion dynamic and its specific intensification of the personal scrutiny were features of the female relationships that the male relationships did not replicate in the same form. This is not to say that male staff had an easy time. It is to say that the specific form of the pattern that the word describes, the specific quality of mercilessness as it applied to the women specifically, had a character in the female relationships that exceeded what the male staff experienced, and that the exceeding was a function of the specific social role that the women occupied in the household, and the specific dynamic that role produced. The women bore the worst of it. They bore it in the specific proximity of the companion relationship. They bore it without the institutional protections that would have made the bearing more survivable. They bore it because the formation that produced what they were bearing did not include the recognition of their personhood that would have produced mercy. And when the bearing exceeded its capacity, when the accumulation of the daily experience of being seen and assessed and found wanting as people rather than as functions produced the cost that it produced, they left, or were managed out, into the silence of the NDAs and the settlements and the organized departures that the palace used to contain what the bearing had produced. The containing was the institution's response to the cost, not the prevention of the cost. The containing of it. The women bore the cost. The institution contained the evidence of the bearing. This is the distinction that the official account of Anne's household has always required to remain invisible. It is not invisible anymore. The palace knew early, not in the form of documented complaints filed through formal channels and assessed by institutional processes that produced written findings, not in the form of the kind of explicit, attributable, formally recorded knowledge that organizations produce when they engage with problems through the mechanisms that good institutional governance requires. In the form that knowledge moves inside royal households, through the networks of senior staff and courtiers and private secretaries whose professional world spans multiple households and whose professional function requires awareness of what is happening in all of them. The networks are the primary information infrastructure of the palace's administrative world. Senior courtiers move between households and between roles across careers that span decades. Private secretaries who have served in one royal's household move to senior positions in another's. Ladies-in-waiting whose service in one household ends take their experience and their knowledge into the social world that connects all the households and that carries information between them in the way that small, highly interconnected professional worlds carry information through the oblique reference, the careful conversation, the specific quality of professional knowledge that people share with each other when they trust the recipient to understand both the information and the discretion its sharing requires. Through these networks, the palace's administrative apparatus accumulated knowledge of what was happening in Anne's household with a thoroughness that the absence of formal documentation does not adequately describe. The knowledge was informal. It did not exist as a file or a report or a formal assessment. It existed as the professional understanding of the people whose networks had exposed them to it. But informal knowledge, in a small and highly interconnected professional world, is not less complete or less actionable than formal knowledge. It is simply held differently and acted on differently. The acting on was the management of departures rather than the management of causes. This is the institutional choice that the palace's administrative apparatus made consistently across the decades of the pattern's operation, and it is the choice that most clearly reveals what the palace understood its institutional interest to be. The choice was not to engage with the pattern, to provide the feedback to Anne about the effect of her behavior on her staff that might have altered the behavior, to intervene in the working culture of the household in ways that might have made it less costly for the women inside it. The choice was to manage the consequences of the pattern, to organize the departures of the women whose continued presence would have required more active management of the situation than the palace preferred, and to ensure through NDAs and settlements and organized silences that the management of the departures did not generate the kind of public information that would have made the pattern visible in the mainstream record. The choice reveals the institutional calculation. The palace's calculation consistently across the decades of the pattern's operation was that the cost of engaging with the pattern, the disruption to the relationship with Anne, the acknowledgement of a problem in a senior royal's household, the management of the institutional complexity that a genuine intervention would have produced, exceeded the cost of managing the consequences. The consequences were manageable. The women could be managed out with the tools available. The NDAs could be enforced. The semi-public record could be managed to prevent the pattern from breaking through to the mainstream. The calculation was not wrong on its own terms. The management did work, in the operational sense. The pattern did not break through to the mainstream during Anne's lifetime of public service in a form that required official engagement. The official account was maintained. The surface held. But the calculation was made entirely in the institution's interest and not at all in the interest of the women who were bearing the cost of the pattern, while the palace calculated that managing the consequences was preferable to addressing the causes. The women were not parties to the calculation. Their interests were not inputs to it. They were the units whose departure could be organized and whose silence could be purchased and whose experience could be managed out of the record, instruments of a management operation rather than people whose well-being the institution had any obligation to protect. The palace's knowledge of the pattern developed through several specific channels that the semi-public record allows identification of, however incompletely. The first channel was the senior courtiers, the people at the top of the palace's administrative structure, the private secretaries and the senior officials whose oversight responsibilities included all the royal households, received information about Anne's household through the professional networks described above, and through the direct reports that the management of the more difficult departures required. When a departure reached the level of difficulty that required palace involvement, the complaints that generated legal advice, the settlements that required financial approval from the palace's administrative structures, the NDAs that required the palace's legal apparatus to draft and execute, the senior courtiers were directly involved. Their involvement meant that the knowledge of those specific situations was explicit rather than merely networked. The explicit knowledge, the direct involvement in the management of specific departures, was concentrated in the cases that were most difficult, the cases that required financial settlements, the cases that involved complaints explicit enough to generate legal concern, the cases in which the woman leaving was in a position to make the semi-public accounts more public than the semi-public record already contained. These cases were the visible tip of a larger pattern that the palace understood through its networks, even when the specific cases did not individually rise to the level of formal management involvement. The understanding was sufficient. The professional knowledge of the people whose networks connected them to the household was sufficiently complete that the senior courtiers and private secretaries whose institutional responsibility included awareness of what was happening in the royal households could not credibly claim that the pattern was invisible to them. The second channel was the women themselves, in the specific indirect form that the social code and the legal framework permitted. Women who left Anne's household entered the social world of the aristocratic and upper gentry milieu in which their service had been located, and they carried their experience with them into that world in the form that the code permitted, not the public statement, not the direct complaint to a regulatory body or an employment tribunal or a journalist. The private conversation, the oblique reference, the specific quality of description that people use when they are telling something true in terms that maintain the plausible deniability the code requires. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. These conversations were part of the social world that the palace's senior staff also inhabited. The senior courtiers and their families moved through the same aristocratic world as the women who had served in Anne's household. The information that the women carried into that world, in the form the code permitted, reached the palace's administrative apparatus through the same social networks that carried all information of this kind, not as formal complaints, not as documented testimony, but as the professional and social knowledge of a small interconnected world that was sufficiently transparent to its own members to make the maintenance of genuine institutional ignorance essentially impossible. The third channel was the direct observation of the people inside the palace's administrative structure who worked directly with Anne, The private secretaries and senior staff whose professional role required them to work alongside Anne and to manage the administrative dimensions of her public life were inside the household's working culture in a way that made their own direct observation of the culture available to them as knowledge, whether they chose to act on that knowledge or not. The direct observation produced its own form of the professional knowledge that the networks also produced, the understanding, built from direct experience rather than second-hand account, of the specific working culture that the household's pattern had produced. This direct observation knowledge was the most complete knowledge available to the palace's administrative apparatus, and it was held by the people whose institutional position was most directly responsible for the management of what they observed. What they did with it was the management operation this account has described. They managed the consequences, they organized the departures, they deployed the NDAs, they maintained the surface. They did not provide the feedback to Anne that the knowledge of the pattern required. The provision of that feedback, the direct, honest, institutional communication to a senior royal that the working culture of their household was producing costs in the people inside it that required correction, was within the institutional authority of the people who held the knowledge. It was not exercised. The reasons for the non-exercise are not fully available in the public record. What the semi-public record suggests, consistent with the general institutional logic of how the palace manages its relationships with senior royals, is that the specific relationship between the palace's administrative apparatus and the senior royals it serves creates a powerful structural disincentive against the provision of uncomfortable feedback. The private secretaries and senior courtiers whose institutional role is to serve the senior royals they are attached to are people whose professional standing depends on the quality of the relationship they maintain with the royal they serve. The provision of feedback that a senior royal does not want to receive damages the relationship. Damaged relationships end careers. The structural incentive for people whose careers depend on the maintenance of the relationship is always toward the management of discomfort rather than the honest communication that produces it. This structural incentive is not unique to the palace. It is a recognizable feature of institutions where the people responsible for providing honest feedback upward are the same people whose standing depends on the approval of the people they should be providing the feedback to. The incentive toward management over honesty is built into the structure, and the structure produced in the palace's handling of Anne's household exactly what structures with this incentive always produce: the management of consequences and the non-engagement with causes. The palace knew the knowledge was accumulated through multiple channels across the decades of the pattern's operation. The knowledge was sufficient to have produced the feedback and the intervention that the pattern required. The knowledge was not used for that purpose. It was used for management. The management served the institution's interests. The women bore the cost of the choice that the management represented. The bearing continued. The knowing continued alongside it. The knowing and the doing nothing with the knowing, that is the institutional failure this account is describing. It is not unique to this household or this institution. It is the failure that institutions with structural disincentives against honest upward feedback always eventually produce. The palace produced it. The women bore it. The record needs to say so. Silence in the institutional sense is not free. The natural silence, the silence that the social code of the aristocratic world produces without legal instrument, the silence of people who have been formed to understand that private matters are private and that speaking about them publicly is a fundamental breach of who they understand themselves to be. That silence costs the institution nothing beyond the maintenance of the conditions that make the code operational. The conditions are maintained through the institutional architecture of belonging and exclusion, through the social world's self-enforcement of the discretion it prizes, through the formation of the people inside it in ways that make the code internal rather than imposed. The purchased silence is different. It arrives when the natural silence has failed, or when the institution has calculated that the natural silence is insufficient for the specific situation, that the person whose silence is required has either been insufficiently formed by the code to maintain it without external support, or has reached the specific limit of what the code's requirements can ask of them, or occupies a social position in which the code's enforcement mechanisms are less powerful than usual. When the natural silence is insufficient, the institution reaches for the purchased version. The purchasing takes forms that have been developed and refined across decades of institutional practice in exactly these circumstances. The NDA, the non-disclosure agreement, signed as the condition of a financial settlement or a managed departure, is the most explicit form of the purchasing. It converts what had been a social code obligation into a legal one, binding the person who signs it to the silence the institution requires through the mechanism of contract law, rather than the mechanism of social belonging. The conversion is significant because it changes the nature of the breach. A person who speaks after signing an NDA is not just breaking the social code, which is a matter of social consequence, but breaking a legal contract, which is a matter of legal consequence with the palace's resources available to enforce it. The NDAs that were associated with departures from Anne's household, the number of which is not fully available in any public source because the NDAs themselves are confidential and their existence is managed by the same apparatus that manages the information they are designed to contain, are known to exist in the semi-public record through the accounts of people who were aware of specific departures and the management that accompanied them, not through the NDAs themselves, which are by definition not available. Through the oblique, carefully hedged accounts of people who know the departures happened, who know the management was deployed, and who describe what they know in the specific language of people communicating what they cannot directly state. The language is consistent across multiple accounts from multiple sources across multiple periods of the household's operation. The accounts describe specific departures that were accompanied by financial arrangements. They describe the specific involvement of the palace's legal apparatus in the management of those departures. They describe the specific quality of the silence that followed the departures, the silence of people who have something to say and who are not saying it for reasons that the social code alone does not fully explain. The financial dimension of the purchased silence is the most directly significant of its components because money is the most concrete evidence of the institution's assessment of what the silence was worth. The palace does not spend money on the management of information that it does not consider worth managing. The deployment of financial resources to purchase the silence of departing staff is the institution's financial statement about the value of the information the departing staff hold and the importance of that information not reaching the public record. The amounts involved in the specific settlements from Anne's household are not publicly available. They are contained within the NDAs that contain them, which are confidential, or within the palace's internal financial records, which are not subject to the kind of freedom of information disclosure that public sector bodies are subject to. What the semi-public record contains is the existence of settlements, the accounts of people who know that financial arrangements were made with specific departing members of Anne's household, without the specific amounts that would allow a precise assessment of the palace's financial valuation of the silence. The existence is sufficient for the purpose of this account. The existence of financial settlements with departing staff is as it was in the discussion of the palace's management of Philip's private life. The institution's acknowledgement, expressed through the financial form that acknowledgement takes in these circumstances, that the departures were not ordinary staff transitions and that what the departing staff knew required more than the social code to contain. The NDA as a legal instrument has a specific character in the context of royal households that differs from its character in civilian employment contexts. In civilian employment, the NDA is a mechanism for the protection of genuinely confidential commercial information, the trade secrets, the financial details, the operational specifics that a departing employee carries with them and whose public disclosure could harm the employer's legitimate commercial interests. The law recognizes this function and permits the enforcement of NDAs used for this purpose. In a royal household, the information that the NDA is used to protect is not commercial, it is reputational. The information that departing staff from Anne's household were required to sign away their right to disclose was not information about trade secrets or operational specifics whose disclosure would harm the palace's commercial interests. Because the palace does not have commercial interests in the conventional sense, it was information about the private behavior of a senior royal whose public standing the institution had an interest in protecting. The NDA in this context is a reputational protection instrument used to ensure that the experience of the departing staff member does not reach the public record in a form that would damage the royal's image. The use of NDAs for reputational protection in employment contexts has been the subject of increasing legal and public policy scrutiny in the years following the #Me Too movement, which brought to public attention the widespread deployment of NDAs to suppress the accounts of people who had experienced harassment and mistreatment in professional contexts. The scrutiny has produced legal reform in some jurisdictions and advocacy for reform in others, with the central argument that NDAs used to suppress accounts of mistreatment are instruments of institutional cover-up, rather than legitimate tools of commercial information management. The palace's use of NDAs to manage departures from Anne's household falls clearly within the category of reputational protection rather than commercial information management. The women who signed them were not in possession of trade secrets. They were in possession of first-hand accounts of a working environment that the palace had decided the public should not receive. The NDAs were the legal instrument through which that decision was enforced. The conversion of the palace's institutional preference for silence into a legal obligation that the departing staff were required to accept as the condition of the financial settlement that made the departure manageable for them. The acceptance of the legal obligation under these circumstances is not uncomplicated. The women who signed the NDAs did so in the specific context of a departure from a working environment that had been costly to them, with the knowledge that the palace's legal resources were substantially greater than their own, and with the financial settlement that accompanied the NDA representing, in at least some cases, a financial provision that was materially significant to their circumstances. The acceptance was, in this context, not entirely free. The coercion is not necessarily explicit. The palace does not need to threaten departing staff members with legal action or social consequences to make the signing of an NDA feel like the rational choice in the circumstances. The circumstances themselves, the power asymmetry, the legal resource disparity, the financial significance of the settlement, the awareness that the alternative to signing is a departure with no financial provision and no legal protection against whatever the palace might choose to do with the information the departing staff member carries, are sufficient to make the rational calculation point towards signing. The women who signed did so rationally, within the specific constraints of their circumstances. The rationality of the individual decisions does not make the institution's deployment of the NDAs less significant as an institutional act. The institution used a legal instrument, backed by financial provision and legal resource asymmetry, to ensure that the accounts of women who had experienced a specific working environment did not reach the public. The using was deliberate and informed and resourced by an institution that understood what it was doing and why. What the institution was doing was protecting the surface of Anne's public image. The surface of the official account of a senior royal whose public standing the institution considered worth the financial and legal resources deployed to maintain it. The protection served the institution's interests in the specific way that surface protection always serves institutional interests, by ensuring that the public account of the institution and its members corresponds to the account the institution wants the public to receive, rather than the account that the people inside the institution's households might produce, if the mechanisms designed to prevent that account were not deployed. The settlements and the NDAs were the financial and legal dimensions of the palace's management of Anne's household. They were the most concrete, most directly attributable dimension, the one that leaves the most traceable evidence in the semi-public record, because money and legal instruments, however confidential, produce the kind of institutional footprint that the purely social dimensions of the management do not. The footprint is in the accounts of people who know the departures happened and know the management was deployed, and who describe what they know in the careful language of people who are communicating something real through the mechanism of the oblique reference and the carefully constructed plausible deniability. It is in the specific quality of the silence that surrounds the women who left Anne's household and who have not spoken in any public forum about their experience. The silence that is thicker than the social code alone produces, that has the specific character of silence that has been reinforced by a legal obligation imposed at the moment of departure. The silence was purchased. The purchasing was the institution's acknowledgement that the price of the silence was worth paying. The price, paid repeatedly across the decades of the patent's operation, was the institution's financial statement about the value it placed on the maintenance of the official account against the accounts of the women who had been inside the household and who knew what the official account did not contain. The women accepted the price. They had rational reasons to accept it in the specific circumstances of their departures. The acceptance does not mean the price was fair. The fairness question is not answered by the rationality of the individual decisions under specific circumstances. It is answered by the institutional calculation that produced those circumstances, the decision to purchase silence rather than address the causes that made the silence necessary. The causes were not addressed. The silence was purchased. The official account was maintained. The women bore the cost that the management contained but did not prevent. The containing was the institution's work. The bearing was the women's. The distinction between the two, between the institution's management and the women's bearing, is the distinction this account is making visible. The purchased silence kept it invisible for decades. It is not purchased here. The gap between the public an and the private one is maintained by something more sophisticated than simple concealment. Simple concealment, the straightforward suppression of damaging information, is the crude instrument of institutions that have not yet developed the more refined approach. The more refined approach does not suppress the private information so much as it ensures that the public information is sufficiently compelling, sufficiently consistent, and sufficiently well established in the public's understanding that the private information, when it exists in the semi-public record, cannot achieve the traction it would need to displace the public version. The public an has been assembled with considerable skill across 5 decades of public life, and the assembly has produced something genuinely robust, a public image that is not merely the absence of criticism but the presence of a specific, well-documented, consistently attested positive account, the hardest working royal, the least interested in public attention, the most committed to genuine service rather than the performance of service, the equestrian achievement, the Save the Children presidency and the decades of work associated with it, the specific public manner, direct, unsparing of time wasters, refreshingly free of the performed warmth that the public has come to associate, not always admiringly, with other members of the family. Each of these elements is real. The work is documented. The equestrian achievement is documented. The charitable commitment is documented in the programs and the organizations and the decades of consistent attendance at events that generate no glamour and attract no cameras, but that represent the actual substance of the work that the public role requires. The directness is real and consistently attested by the people who have dealt with Anne in professional contexts, who find it bracing rather than brutal, who receive the absence of the social padding as a form of respect, the treating of them as people who can handle a direct communication rather than people who need the cushioning of managed warmth. The robustness of the public account is the primary mechanism by which the gap between the public and the private an has been maintained. Not the NDAs alone, not the settlements, not the management of departures, though all of these contributed. The primary mechanism is the specific quality of the public account itself, which is sufficiently grounded in real and documentable attributes that the private information, when it circulates in the semi-public record, cannot easily displace it. The person who learns that Anne's household was not what the official account suggests continues to receive the official account through every mainstream press outlet they encounter, in a form that is consistent and well attested, and not obviously in tension with any public evidence. The dissonance between the private information and the public account is manageable in the specific sense that most people who encounter the private information do not have sufficient access to the full pattern of it to organize it into a picture that challenges the public account. The semi-public information is distributed and partial. It exists in the social world that knows about it, in the occasional reference at the edges of mainstream coverage, in the accounts of people who were inside the relevant world, and who describe what they know in the oblique terms that the social code and the legal obligations they carry require. It does not exist as a single comprehensive directly attributed account that would allow someone encountering it for the first time to understand the full pattern. The distribution and partiality of the semi-public information is part of what keeps the gap maintained, not because the distribution and partiality are managed exactly, though the management operation has contributed to them, but because they are the natural state of private knowledge that has not been organized into a public account. The public account has been organized. The palace's communications apparatus over 5 decades has produced and maintained and reinforced a specific version of Princess Anne that is present in every mainstream press outlet, in every documentary, in every commemorative or retrospective account of her public life. The organization of the public account is the product of sustained, professional, well-resourced effort. The private knowledge exists without that organization in the distributed and partial form of things that have not been assembled into a single coherent picture. The assembly asymmetry, the organized public account against the disorganized private knowledge, is the gap's most significant maintenance mechanism. It is more significant than the NDAs because the NDAs can only silence specific people, while the assembly asymmetry shapes the general information environment in which all people receive information about Anne. It is more significant than the social code because the social code can only contain the private knowledge in the social world, while the assembly asymmetry shapes the public world that the social world exists within. The assembly of the public account has operated through several specific mechanisms across the 5 decades of Anne's public life. The first mechanism is access management. The palace's communications apparatus manages which journalists and which media organizations receive the access to Anne that allows for the kind of coverage that shapes the public account. Access to Anne, the interviews, the behind-the-scenes opportunities, the cooperative engagement with specific projects, is extended to outlets and journalists whose coverage has been consistent with the public account the palace wants to maintain. The access produces coverage. The coverage reinforces the public account. The reinforcement of the public account makes the private information less credible to people who receive the mainstream version. The access management has been particularly effective in Anne's case because the specific character of the public account it has produced corresponds closely to the attributes that most news organizations and documentary makers find genuinely compelling. The narrative of the hardest-working royal, who seeks no public attention and receives less credit than her contribution warrants, is a narrative that the press finds sympathetic in a way that does not require the palace to do much beyond making the access available and allowing the coverage to follow. The narrative is self-generating to a significant degree. Once established, it produces its own momentum in a press that has internalized it as the correct framing for Anne. The second mechanism is the strategic use of contrast. The public Anne is defined not only by her positive attributes but by her contrast with other members of the family. The contrast with Charles's complicated history and Andrew's catastrophic public standing and Harry's departure, and the general impression that the Windsor family in its totality is more dysfunctional than its institutional claims suggest. Anne, in this context, functions as the family's evidence that its formation does not inevitably produce dysfunction. She is the one who got on with it, the one who did not make headlines for the wrong reasons, the one whose public record, compared to the records of her siblings, is the most obviously admirable. The contrast works in the palace's management of the public account by making the positive assessment of Anne feel like a conclusion the public has arrived at independently through the comparison of available evidence, rather than a narrative that has been produced and maintained through institutional management. The independence of the conclusion makes it more robust than a conclusion that is clearly the product of institutional messaging, because conclusions that feel like independent assessments are harder to dislodge than conclusions that feel like institutional claims. The third mechanism is the management of the directness. The attribute that is most potentially problematic in the public account, the directness that is the public expression of the formation that produced the private pattern, is managed in the public account through the specific framing that the press has adopted around it. The directness is framed as admirable. The press coverage of Anne's public manner consistently positions the directness as a refreshing contrast to the managed warmth of other royals, as evidence of authenticity, as the mark of someone who respects people enough to tell them the truth rather than performing a warmth she does not feel. The framing is not entirely inaccurate. The directness is real. The authenticity of it, compared to the performed warmth that the press criticizes in other contexts, is real. But the framing selectively presents the directness as a quality that operates in public and semi-public contexts, in professional interactions, in public engagements, in the contexts where the power relationship between Anne and the people she is dealing with is modulated by the public setting and the shared awareness of the cameras. The framing does not engage with the directness in the private context, in the household, in the companion relationship, in the unmodulated expression of the formation that the public setting does not require Anne to manage. The directness in that context is a different thing from the directness that the press frames as admirable. It is the directness that the word describes, the absence of the accommodation that makes the expression of high standards sustainable for the people who are its continuous recipients in a relationship they cannot leave without the cost that the management apparatus has been deployed to manage. The gap between the public account and the private one is maintained in the end by the specific character of the public account's construction, the robustness, the genuine attributes it contains, the contrast effects, the framing of the directness, combined with the distribution and partiality of the private knowledge and the management operation that keeps the private knowledge from achieving the organization that would allow it to challenge the public account. The maintenance has been effective across 5 decades of Anne's public life. It has been effective enough that the mainstream press coverage of Anne remains, as of the period this account covers, substantially consistent with the public account the palace has built and maintained. The private information exists in the semi-public record. It has not achieved the mainstream visibility that would constitute a challenge to the official version. This account is part of the process by which private information that has been maintained in the semi-public record eventually moves toward a more public form. Not a dramatic displacement of the official account, the robustness of the official account, and the genuine truth of the attributes it contains, means that the private information adds to the public picture rather than replacing it. The public Anne is not false, the private one is additional. The full picture contains both. The maintenance of the gap has served the institution's interests for 5 decades. The institution's interests and the interests of the women who bore the private pattern while the gap was maintained are not the same interests. They have never been the same interests. The gap between them is the gap this account is making visible. It has been maintained long enough. Leaving is supposed to be the end of it. The institutional logic of the managed departure, the NDA, the settlement, the organized silence, is premised on the assumption that the departure resolves the situation. The woman leaves, the silence is secured, the institution continues, the surface holds. The resolution is complete in the institutional sense, which is the only sense the institution is designed to assess. What the institutional logic does not account for is what happens to the woman after the leaving, what she carries out of the household when the departure is complete, what the bearing has produced in her that the settlement addresses financially but does not address in any other dimension, what the silence legally enforced from the moment of signing requires her to manage in the years and decades that follow the departure. The women who left Anne's household and who were most affected by what the household had produced did not leave the experience at the palace gates. The institutional logic assumes containment, that the experience is contained within the household and its consequences contained within the departure management. But the institutional assumption is wrong in the specific way that institutional assumptions about the effects of professional mistreatment are always wrong. The effects do not stay where the institution manages them, they travel with the person. They become part of the person's life in ways that the institution neither observes nor takes responsibility for, because the institution's accountability ends at the departure and the NDA, and what happens after is not the institution's concern. The women who never recovered are not a dramatic category. They are not women who were destroyed in obvious, visible ways that would be straightforwardly legible as the consequence of their service. The damage the pattern produced was rarely of the kind that produces sudden, catastrophic outcomes. It was the kind that produces the slower, quieter, more persistent outcomes that are harder to attribute directly to any specific cause, and that are therefore easier to manage into invisibility, not by the institution which has no visibility into what happened after the departure, but by the general tendency of human beings and human institutions to avoid engaging with suffering that cannot be unambiguously attributed and that does not present itself in forms that demand engagement. The forms the suffering took, as described in the accounts available from the semi-public record, were consistent in their general character across multiple women across multiple periods of the household's operation. The most common form was the specific damage to professional confidence that sustained exposure to an environment of continuous critical assessment without corresponding acknowledgement produces in the people who are its recipients. The women who had served in Anne's household and who had experienced the pattern this account describes left the service with a relationship to their own professional capability that was different from the relationship they had brought to it. Not universally, not in every woman who had served. Some women left the service with their professional confidence intact, either because their specific experience of the household had been less directly in the line of the pattern, or because their temperament and their resources had allowed them to absorb the experience without lasting damage to the specific dimension of professional self-assessment. But in the women who had been most directly and most consistently the recipients of the pattern, the damage to professional confidence was a consistent feature of the post-departure account. Professional confidence is not easily restored once it has been damaged in the specific way that sustained exposure to continuous critical assessment damages it. The damage is not the ordinary damage of someone who has received negative feedback about specific professional shortcomings and who rebuilds confidence through the correction of those shortcomings and the receipt of positive feedback when the correction is achieved. It is the damage of someone who has received the communication repeatedly and without effective counter, that their fundamental adequacy is in question, that the problem is not specific and correctable but general and inherent. The damage operates at a level below specific professional skills, in the person's relationship to their own capacity to perform any professional function adequately. Rebuilding from this specific damage requires, at minimum, a sustained period in a working environment that provides the positive feedback and the acknowledgement of adequacy that the damaged environment withheld. It may require professional support, the kind of therapeutic or coaching engagement that helps a person reconstruct the relationship to their own capability that the damaged environment has impaired. It requires time and the specific resources, financial, social, professional, that the pursuit of the reconstruction demands. The women who left Anne's household with this specific damage were not universally in possession of the resources the reconstruction required. Some were the women from the aristocratic and upper gentry world who had the financial independence and the social network and the access to professional support that their social position provided. These women, damaged by the service but resourced for the recovery, managed the reconstruction with the varying degree of success that the specific depth of the damage and the specific resources available to them allowed. Others were less resourced for the recovery. The women whose financial situation made the NDA settlement more materially significant, whose acceptance of the settlement was driven partly by the financial need the settlement addressed, were the women whose resources for the post-departure reconstruction were most constrained. The settlement provided a financial cushion for the departure. It did not provide the sustained financial support that the reconstruction of professional confidence from the specific damage the service had produced required over the months and years of the post-departure period. The second form the suffering took was the specific damage to social standing that the managed departure and the NDA produced for some of the women who had served in the household. The social standing of the women whose service was in the aristocratic world depended significantly on the quality of the transition from the service into the next phase of their professional and social lives. Royal service conducted and concluded well was a social asset, the kind of professional experience that opened doors and conferred the specific standing that proximity to the institution provides. A managed departure, a departure organized by the palace and accompanied by the legal instrument of the NDA, was not the same thing as a concluded service. It was an organized exit from a situation that had become professionally unsustainable, and the organization of it, however managed in its public presentation, was perceptible to the people in the relevant social world who understood how palace departures worked and what the specific character of a managed one indicated about the situation that had produced it. The perceptibility was not uniformly damaging. The social code of the world operated to protect the women from the most explicit forms of the social consequence, because the code prized discretion and the discretion operated for the women's protection as well as the institutions. But the specific standing that the service might have been expected to confer was not always fully available to the women whose departures had been managed rather than concluded in the manner that a successful and honorable service produced. The protection of the code was partial. The expectation of the standing that the service had been supposed to provide was not always met. The third form was the most private and the most persistent. The form that does not show up in professional records or social standing metrics but that exists in the daily quality of a person's life, the specific relationship to themselves that the experience of the service had altered. The women who had been most directly the recipients of the pattern's expression left the service with a changed relationship to their own sense of worth, to their expectations of how they would be treated by the people whose authority over them they were subject to the specific quality of wariness that people develop when sustained experience has taught them that the environments they enter carry specific risks they did not previously know to look for. The wariness is protective. It is the formation from direct experience of a set of perceptions about the world that are more accurate than the pre-experience perceptions were. The pre-experience Anne's household produced the formation, and the formation, however costly, is information. The women who carried it out of the service knew something about specific institutional environments and specific kinds of power relationships that they had not known before. The knowing is not nothing. But the knowing came at the cost that the service had produced, and the cost was the cost that this account has been describing, the sustained experience of an environment in which the absence of mercy and the exercise of power had produced a specific kind of damage that the departure managed but did not resolve. The damage's specific character in each woman was shaped by the specific nature of her experience and the specific resources she brought to the bearing and the specific circumstances of her departure and its management. It was not uniform. Some women emerged from the service more damaged than others. Some emerged with specific professional consequences that were directly attributable to what the service had produced. Others emerged with more diffuse consequences, the quieter, more persistent alterations to the quality of daily life that do not produce dramatic outcomes, but that constitute a specific form of harm nonetheless. The accounts available in the semi-public record are not complete enough to produce a full and individually specific account of each woman's post-departure life. They produce a general picture, the consistent character across multiple accounts of the specific kinds of damage the service produced, and the specific ways that damage expressed itself in the post-departure period. The general picture is sufficient to describe the pattern and to make visible what the institution's management of the departures was designed to prevent from becoming visible, the evidence that the women did not simply leave and return to their lives unchanged, that the service produced costs that traveled with them beyond the palace gates and into the years that followed. The institution's management was designed for institutional containment, not for the women's recovery. The NDA and the settlement addressed the institution's exposure. They did not address the women's damage. The addressing of the women's damage was not part of the institutional calculation because the institutional calculation did not include the women's subsequent lives as a variable it was responsible for. This is the gap between institutional management and human accountability. Management contains, accountability recognizes. The institution managed, it did not recognize. The women who never fully recovered from what the service had produced lived their post-departure lives in the space that the gap between management and recognition creates, the space where the institution's containment operation ends and the human reality of what the containment was containing begins. They are in that space still, the ones who are still living. Some of them have rebuilt. Some have rebuilt substantially, with the resources their circumstances permitted and the time that the reconstruction required. They are not defined by the service or by what it produced. They are people who experienced a specific thing at cost and who have continued. Some have not rebuilt in the same way. The specific damage the service produced has remained a feature of their lives, not their only feature, not the fact that defines them, but present, a cost that the institution purchased the silence about but did not address, a damage that the management contained but did not resolve. The women who never recovered are not a monument, they are people. The institution that produced the conditions for the damage, and that managed the departure of the damaged, and that purchased the silence of the silenced, and that continued the pattern that produced the next woman's damage, that institution owes them something, not the financial settlement that accompanied the NDA. The acknowledgement that is the only thing that makes damage visible rather than managed. The acknowledgement has not been given. This account is not the acknowledgement, but it is the beginning of the visibility. The visibility is the first condition of the acknowledgement. The women deserve it. They have deserved it since the service ended. The British press is not in any serious reading of its modern history an institution that has shown consistent reluctance to publish damaging information about members of the royal family. The tabloid coverage of Diana's marriage, The phone hacking scandal and its systematic intrusion into the private communications of royals and their staff, the coverage of Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein, the sustained and frequently brutal coverage of Harry and Meghan's departure from the institution, the specific detail of the Bashir interview and the years of coverage that followed it. None of these suggest a press culture that defers automatically to the palace's preference for silence on matters that the palace finds inconvenient. And yet the press never fully said it about Anne. The press knew. The social world that carries the private knowledge of the royal households and the journalistic world that depends on that social world for its access to the material that shapes royal coverage are sufficiently overlapping that the private knowledge of Anne's household, the pattern, the departures, the NDAs, the specific character of the working environment that the word describes, was available to the senior journalists and editors who covered the royal family across the decades of the pattern's operation, not as documented, attributable, legally publishable testimony, as the social knowledge of a small, interconnected world whose information passed between its members in the ways this account has described. The knowing and the not saying coexisted. The knowing did not produce the saying, and the not saying persisted across decades in which the press found the restraint to avoid publishing what it knew. The restraint was not principled silence in the sense of a press culture that had decided the information was not in the public interest. The restraint was produced, as restraint in the coverage of royal stories is usually produced, by the combination of factors this account has described in relation to the palace's management of the information environment. But the specific combination in Anne's case had features that are worth examining individually, because the specific reasons the press did not say it about Anne are different in some important respects from the reasons it did not say things about other royals in other situations. The first reason is the access calculation. The palace's access management has always been the primary mechanism by which the press is incentivized toward compliance with the official account. The access that the palace controls, the photographs, the cooperative interviews, the confirmation of stories that only palace sources can confirm, is distributed to outlets whose coverage meets the palace's requirements and withheld from outlets whose coverage does not. The calculation that senior editors make about whether to publish damaging information about a specific royal always includes the access variable, the assessment of what the publication would cost in terms of the ongoing relationship with the palace's communications operation and the specific access that the relationship provides. For the information about Anne, the access calculation operated in a specific way that the information about more prominent royals did not operate. Anne was not the primary royal story. The access that the palace controlled most valuably was the access to the major narratives, to Charles and Camilla, to William and Kate, to the Queen. The access to Anne was less central to the commercial and journalistic interests of the outlets that covered the royal family than the access to the principles of the major narratives. This meant that the access calculation for stories about Anne was different from the calculation for stories about more prominent royals. The cost of losing access to Anne specifically was lower than the cost of losing access to the major narratives. But the access calculation for Anne's stories was not separate from the access calculation for the major narratives. The palace's communications operation managed the access to all the royals as a single portfolio, not as a collection of individual relationships that could be managed independently. An outlet that published damaging information about Anne risked not just the access to Anne but the access to the portfolio, the overall relationship with the palace's communications operation that provided access to all of the royal coverage the outlet valued. The palace did not need to make this threat explicit. It was understood as the background condition of the access relationship, and the understanding shaped the calculation without requiring articulation. The second reason is the specific character of the information. The information about Anne's household was not the kind of information that the tabloid press finds easiest to publish. The tabloid tradition of royal coverage has always been most comfortable with the dramatic personal story, the affair, the breakdown, the public confrontation, the single event whose emotional charge and narrative clarity make it immediately publishable and immediately comprehensible to a general readership. The information about Anne's household was not of this character. It was a pattern, sustained, consistent, accumulated across decades, that required the kind of extended account that tabloid coverage does not typically provide, and that broadsheet coverage of the royal family has not, with very rare exceptions, been willing to commit to against a senior royal. The pattern is harder to publish than the incident. The incident has a date and a location and named participants and a specific event that can be described and verified and held up as the concrete evidence on which the story rests. The pattern requires the accumulation of multiple accounts across multiple periods from multiple sources, assembled into a picture that is compelling as a whole but whose individual components are each insufficient to bear the weight of publication on their own. The legal architecture that governs the publication of stories about senior royals in Britain, the defamation law, the privacy law, the specific legal risk that attaches to stories about named individuals in positions of public prominence, applies to patterns in ways that make the legal risk of the pattern story higher rather than lower than the legal risk of the incident story. Because the pattern story requires reliance on multiple semi-attributed sources across a long period and offers the subject more avenues for legal challenge than an incident story with specific documented evidence. The third reason is the specific character of Anne's public image and what it would cost to challenge it. The public Anne, the hardest working royal, the least interested in attention, the most committed to genuine service, is not merely a palace construction that exists without supporting evidence. It is a public account grounded in real and documentable attributes that the press itself has verified and attested across 5 decades of coverage. Challenging it requires not just the publication of new information but the displacement of an established account that the press has itself contributed to building. The displacement is uncomfortable for the press in a way that the publication of genuinely new information is not. When the press publishes something that contradicts the official palace account, it is challenging the palace's version. When the press publishes something that contradicts the account the press itself has built over 5 decades, it is challenging its own version. The institutional reluctance to challenge its own previous coverage, the specific form of sunk cost that journalism's relationship to its own archive produces, operates as a brake on the publication of information that would require the press to account for why it did not say it sooner. The "why did you not say it sooner" question is particularly pointed for information about a pattern, for the information about Anne's household, because the pattern was available to the press in its semi-public form across the decades of its operation. The press did not say it during those decades not because it did not know but because the combination of factors described above made not saying the rational calculation. The publication now would require a reckoning with the not saying then. The reckoning is uncomfortable enough that the press has generally preferred to maintain the not saying rather than confront the discomfort. The fourth reason is the specific protection that Anne's public image as a woman provides in the context of the contemporary press's management of stories about female public figures and mistreatment in professional contexts. The press has been sensitized in the post-Me Too period to the dynamics of powerful men mistreating women in professional contexts and to the importance of not allowing institutional power to silence the accounts of the women who bore that mistreatment. The sensitization has produced important changes in how the press covers these stories. It has been less attentive to the dynamics of powerful women's treatment of other women in institutional contexts, to the specific character of female-on-female mistreatment in institutional settings, which the Me Too framework does not accommodate as easily as the male-on-female version. The Anne story is a story about a powerful woman's treatment of the women who served her. It does not fit the most established template for the press's coverage of institutional mistreatment, and the not fitting has contributed to the press's difficulty in engaging with it. The fifth reason, and perhaps the most fundamental, is the absence of a willing named source with sufficient standing and proximity to make the story publishable against the palace's inevitable legal and institutional response. All of the reasons above could be overcome in the normal course of journalism if a source with the right combination of proximity, credibility, and willingness to go on the record were available. The Bashir interview was possible because Diana was willing to go on the record in her own name. The coverage of Andrew's situation was possible because the women in that situation were willing to go on the record. The coverage of Harry and Meghan's departure was possible because Harry and Meghan themselves were the named sources. The information about Anne's household exists in the semi-public record precisely because the named sources required to make it fully publishable against the palace's response are not available. The NDAs have removed the named sources who might otherwise have been available. The social code has removed others. The combination of the legal obligation and the social formation has produced a situation in which the people with the most complete and most directly relevant knowledge are the people who are most legally and socially constrained from providing the named, on-the-record testimony that would make the pattern publishable in the form the press requires to publish it. The press has not said it. The combination of the access calculation, the character of the information, the challenge of displacing an account it helped build, the template difficulty, and the absence of named sources has kept the information in the semi-public record across the decades of its existence. The semi-public record is where it has lived. It is where this account has found it. The account has assembled it from the available sources into the picture that the press's combination of knowing and not saying has prevented from reaching the mainstream in any organized form. The assembly is not the press doing its job. It is the record doing what records do when the press has not done its job, surviving in partial form in the spaces the press is not saying left open, waiting for the moment when the assembly becomes possible. The moment is here. The press never fully said it. The record says it now. The institution that produced Anne is the same institution that produced Charles and Diana's marriage, that produced the management of Philip's private life, that produced the Norfolk situation and the management of Kate's illness and every other instance this account and the accounts preceding it have described of an organization that consistently and deliberately prioritized its own survival above the well-being of the people inside it. The consistency is the point. It is easy in any individual account of any specific situation to attribute what happened to the specific people involved, to the specific character of the person whose behavior produced the harm, to the specific circumstances that produced the specific situation, to the individual moral failures of the individuals whose decisions shaped the outcome. The individual attribution is not wrong. The people involved made choices. The choices had consequences. The moral weight of the choices rests on the people who made them. But the consistency across cases, the pattern that emerges when the individual situations are placed alongside each other and examined for what they share, points to something that the individual attribution does not fully capture. It points to the institution, to the specific character of an institution that has produced across the modern era of its operation a consistent pattern of prioritizing its own survival above the individuals inside it, managing the consequences of that prioritization with the tools available to it, and maintaining the surface of the official account against the private knowledge of what the surface was constructed to conceal. The institution produced Anne, not in the simple sense of having created her. She was born, she was a person. The formation that shaped her was not the institution alone, but in the sense that the institution provided the environment in which the specific formation this account has described was able to express itself in the way it expressed itself without the checks that might have produced a different outcome. The checks, the feedback mechanisms, the accountability structures, the institutional processes that in a civilian context would have produced some form of engagement with the pattern that Anne's household generated, were absent in the specific form they would need to have been present to make a difference. Their absence is the institution's contribution to what happened. The absence of the checks is not accidental, it is structural. It is the product of an institutional design that was not designed for the protection of the people inside it but for the maintenance of the institutional image. The accountability structures that a well-designed institution provides, the grievance mechanisms, the upward feedback channels, the processes for identifying and addressing patterns of harmful behavior in specific parts of the organization, would, in any honest application to a royal household, have produced the kind of engagement with Anne's household that would have altered the pattern or at minimum documented its existence in ways that accountability required. The palace did not design those structures for application to the royal family's private behavior. It designed the structures that exist for the management of the public-facing dimensions of the institution, the communications apparatus, the legal machinery, the access management operation, and it deployed those structures for the management of the consequences of the private behavior, rather than for the accountability of the behavior itself. The design choice reflects the institutional priority, the maintenance of the surface above the accountability of the substance. This design choice has consequences that extend beyond the specific situations it produces. It shapes the institution's relationship to accountability in a fundamental way that cannot be corrected by any individual management operation, because the problem is not in how specific situations are managed, but in the institutional framework within which all situations are managed. The framework is designed for surface maintenance. Surface maintenance is not accountability. The two are not compatible in their fundamental logic. Accountability requires the acknowledgement of substance, and surface maintenance requires its concealment. The incompatibility has been visible in every account this series has produced. The management of Philip's private life, the management of Charles and Diana's marriage, the management of Kate's illness and the Norfolk situation, the management of the departures from Anne's household. In each case, the institutional response to a situation whose substance was damaging to someone inside it was the same response, the management of the information about the situation rather than the engagement with the situation itself. The management contained, it did not address. The containing was the institution's work. The addressing was no one's work, because the institution had not designed the accountability for it. The institution that produced Anne also produced the specific conditions in which the behavior the word describes could operate without effective challenge across the decades of Anne's public life. The conditions are the conditions this account has described: the power asymmetry of the royal household, the absence of the institutional accountability structures that civilian employment provides, the social code that converted the natural silence of the women involved into a cultural obligation, the NDA that converted the cultural obligation into a legal one. Each of these conditions is a product of the institution, of its design, its history, its consistent prioritization of institutional image above individual accountability. The design is not ancient in the sense that nothing can change it. Institutions change. The palace has changed across the modern era in ways that reflect both the changed social environment it operates within and the specific pressures that have been applied to it through the most significant disruptions of the recent decades: Diana, Harry, and Meghan, the Andrew situation, the progressive erosion of the automatic public deference that the monarchy relied on for its ability to manage information about itself without accountability. The changes have been real if limited, and they have moved the institution in directions that the most aggressive version of its historic information management would not have permitted. But the changes have not addressed the fundamental design problem. The institution remains an institution whose accountability structures are designed for the management of its public image rather than the accountability of the private behavior of the people it contains. The management apparatus is more sophisticated than it has ever been. The structures that would provide genuine accountability for the private behavior of senior royals remain as absent as they have always been. What the Anne situation reveals about this institution is something specific and important. It reveals that the design problem is not limited to the extraordinary situations, the dramatic scandals, the public breakups, the situations that generate the level of public attention that forces at least the appearance of institutional engagement. It operates in the ordinary situations too. In the daily working of a royal household, in the accumulation of the pattern this account has described across decades of a senior royal's private life, in the consistent management of the consequences of that pattern without any engagement with the pattern itself. The ordinary is the most revealing dimension. The extraordinary situations Diana, Andrew generate their own exposure through the scale of the public attention they attract and the pressure that attention places on the institutional management operation. The ordinary situations are managed without the pressure of that attention, in the quieter spaces where the institution's design operates without the corrective force of external scrutiny, producing the outcomes that the design is calibrated to produce, the surface maintained, the consequences managed, the accountability absent. The institution also reveals, through the Anne situation, something about how the formation it produces in the people inside it travels across generations. The formation that Philip transmitted to Anne, the demanding expectations, the preference for self-sufficiency, the specific deficit in the accommodation of people who fall short of the standard, was itself a formation that the institution had not challenged. Philip's formation was produced by circumstances that predated the institution's formation of him, but the institution absorbed Philip into its framework without the engagement with the formation's problematic dimensions that accountability would have required. The absorption without engagement allowed the formation to travel from Philip to Anne in the specific way that unaddressed formations travel, through the lived example, through the environment the formation creates in the household, through the children who absorb the environment and reproduce its essential qualities in the environments they create for the people around them. The reproduction is the institution's failure compounded. The failure to engage with Philip's formation produced the failure to engage with Anne's, which produced the failure to engage with the pattern in Anne's household, which produced the management of the consequences across decades without the accountability that would have prevented the pattern from continuing. The compounding is what generational institutional failure looks like. Not a single catastrophic failure, but the accumulation of smaller failures, each one managed, each one contained, none of them addressed, into a pattern that the accumulation makes visible in ways that the individual failures do not. The institution is visible here, not in the dramatic form of its most public failures, but in the ordinary form of its daily operation. The design choices, the absent accountability structures, the consistent prioritization of surface over substance, the management of consequences without engagement with causes. The visibility is what this account is for, not the punishment of individuals, not the dramatic exposure of a single catastrophic event. The visibility of the pattern that the institution's design produces. The pattern that the institution has managed for decades to keep invisible in the mainstream record through the combination of tools this account has described. The pattern is visible now, in the word that came from someone who had been inside the household, in the women who bore what the word describes, in the departures and the NDAs and the settlements and the purchased silences, in the post-departure lives of the women who carried what the service had produced into the years that followed, in the press's knowing and not saying across the decades of the pattern's operation, in the institution's knowing and managing rather than addressing across the same decades. The pattern is visible. The institution that produced it is visible through the pattern. The visibility is the beginning of the accountability that the institutional design has consistently prevented. It is only a beginning, but beginnings are what accounts like this are for. The institution has been managing its way around beginnings for a very long time. This one is harder to manage than most, because the pattern is documented, because the word exists, because the women existed, because the record, partial, incomplete, assembled from what survived the management, exists. It is here. The Crown's silence has a price list. It is not published anywhere. It does not appear in any official document or institutional record or annual report of the palace's operations. It exists in the specific form that institutional costs always exist when the institution has designed itself to avoid accountability, in the lives of the people who paid it, in the years those people lived after the paying, in the specific quality of what was not restored to them after the institution had taken what it required. The women who worked for Princess Anne and who bore what the word describes paid specific items on the price list. They paid with the professional confidence the service damaged and that the departure settlement did not restore. They paid with the social standing that the managed departure produced rather than the honored transition that genuine service concludes with. They paid with the specific alteration to their relationship to themselves, the changed sense of their own worth, the specific weariness that sustained exposure to merciless judgment in a relationship of extreme power asymmetry produces, the persistent quality of a damage that the NDA contained in the legal sense but did not address in any other. They paid, and the institution took the payment and filed it in the category of managed consequences, the departures organized, the settlements made, the silences purchased, and continued with the operation of maintaining the surface that the payment had been extracted to protect. The Crown's silence costs the institution nothing in the direct financial sense beyond the settlement amounts, which are operational costs absorbed within the palace's considerable resource base and which are, from the institution's perspective, simply the price of the management. The settlements are not experienced as costs in the way that genuine accountability costs an institution. The disruption of the surface, the reckoning with the substance, the public engagement with what has been concealed and its consequences. The settlements are experienced as solutions. They resolve the specific situation, they purchase the silence, they allow the surface to continue. The surface continues. The cost is paid by the people who bear it. This is the fundamental structure of institutional silence as a management strategy. The cost is externalized to the people whose silence is purchased, rather than borne by the institution whose interest the silence serves. The institution manages the cost. The people bear it. The management is not the bearing. The two are categorically different, and the institution that conflates them, that treats the managed settlement as equivalent to the addressed harm, is an institution that has decided by design or by default that the externalization of cost to the people inside it is an acceptable way to operate. The Crown has operated this way for a very long time. Not only in Anne's household, the price list extends across every account this series has produced and across the larger history of the institution that the accounts describe. Diana paid items on the price list. The women whose names Philip's management apparatus buried paid items on the price list. Kate has been paying items on the price list for years in the specific currency of sustained silence and managed opacity that the Norfolk situation required. The women who served Charles's household in the years when his private life was what it was paid items on the price list in the specific currency of the not saying that the code and the access and the legal architecture required. The price list is long. The paying has been continuous. The institution has maintained the surface across the paying with the efficiency of an organization that has been doing this for a very long time and that has refined its management of the payment process into something that functions with minimal disruption to the institutional operation. The cost of the Crown's silence is also paid in a different register by the public that receives the official account, the surface that the silence protects, receives an incomplete account of the institution it funds and maintains, and whose continuation it is implicitly asked to endorse through the cultural and constitutional arrangements that sustain the monarchy. The incomplete account deprives the public of the information it would need to make a fully informed assessment of the institution's fitness for its role. This deprivation is not accidental. It is the intended outcome of the management operation. The palace's management of information about itself is specifically designed to ensure that the public receives the account the palace wants the public to receive, rather than the account that honest engagement with the institution's full record would produce. The design serves the institution's interest in its own continuation. It does not serve the public's interest in the honest account of what the institution is and does and costs the people inside it. The public's interest and the institution's interest have always been in tension around this specific question, the question of what the public knows about what the institution does to maintain its own image. The tension has been managed for most of the monarchy's modern history by the institution's considerable advantage in the management of the information environment. The advantage is eroding. The conditions that made the management operation most effective, the press's dependence on access, the social code's containment of private knowledge, the legal architecture's deterrence of publication, the automatic public deference that gave the official account its credibility, are all less effective than they were for the reasons this account and the accounts preceding it have described. The erosion is the context in which accounts like this one become possible. The partial, incomplete, assembled from what survived version of the story that this account represents is possible because the management operation's effectiveness has eroded sufficiently that the information it was designed to contain has reached the semi-public record in forms that allow assembly into something more organized than the individual fragments that constitute the semi-public record in its natural state. The assembly is not justice. This account is not the accountability that the women who bore the cost of the Crown's silence deserve. It is the visibility that is the first condition of the accountability, the making visible of the pattern and the institution and the specific cost that the pattern produced and that the institution managed without addressing. The visibility matters because the Crown's silence has been maintained in part by the invisibility of what it costs. An institution whose silence is invisible, whose management of consequences produces no public record of the consequences it is managing, is an institution that can maintain the silence indefinitely because the silence's maintenance generates no public pressure for the accountability that would end it. The visibility generates the pressure, not immediately, not automatically, not as a direct mechanical consequence of a single account, but the accumulation of visibility, the progressive organization of what the semi-public record contains into accounts that the public can receive and assess, changes the conditions in which the institution operates. The institution that can maintain the silence in conditions of complete invisibility cannot maintain the same silence in conditions where the pattern is visible, where the cost is documented, where the people who paid it have been named in the record rather than managed out of it. The women who never recovered from what the service produced deserve the visibility, not as a consolation prize in lieu of the accountability they deserve, but as the first step toward it. The visibility establishes the record makes the accountability possible. The accountability, whenever it comes, in whatever form it takes, rests on the record that the visibility creates. Princess Anne is in her 70s. She continues to serve. The public account continues to describe the hardest working royal, the least interested in attention, the most committed to genuine service. The account is not false. The attributes it describes are real. The private account also continues to exist in the semi-public record, in the private knowledge of the world that the household existed within, in the memories of the women who bore what the word describes, in the word itself, which is still in the world, said once by someone who had been there, carrying the weight of the full account that the single word summarizes: merciless. The Crown's silence was designed to prevent that word from reaching the mainstream record. The design was sufficiently effective that the word has not in any organized form reached the mainstream until now. It has reached the record now. The cost of the Crown's silence is in the record now. The women who paid it are in the record now. The institution that required the payment and managed the paying and maintained the surface that the payment protected is in the record now. Records are not justice, they are the condition of it. The condition is met. The rest, the accountability, the acknowledgement, the specific form that the reckoning with the Crown's silence eventually takes, is what comes next. What comes next is not this account's to determine, it is the institution's. The institution has been choosing management over accountability for a very long time. The record makes the choice visible. The visible choice is the institution's to own. It has always been the institution's to own. The women who bore the cost of the choice never had the option of not owning what the choice produced in their lives. The institution has had the option. It has exercised the option consistently and continuously for decades. The record says so. The record is here. The Crown's silence is in it. The cost is in it. The women are in it. They are not managed out of this. They remain. Not every woman left. This is the part of the account that the easier version of the story omits because the easier version requires a clean division: the women who bore the cost and departed, and the institution that managed their departure into silence. The clean division is satisfying in the way that clean divisions are always satisfying. It organizes the material, it assigns the roles, it produces the narrative structure that allows a reader to understand what happened and to whom and at whose hands. The women who stayed complicate the clean division. They are not the women who escaped the pattern. They are not the women whose experience of the household was fundamentally different from the experience of the women who left. They are the women who absorbed the same working environment, bore the same pattern, paid some version of the same price, and remained, for years, in some cases for decades, in the service of a principle whose working culture this account has described in terms that make the remaining seem from the outside almost incomprehensible. The remaining is not incomprehensible. It is the product of a specific combination of factors that the outside view does not fully engage with, the factors that made staying for these specific women in their specific circumstances, the calculation that continued to produce the same answer across the years of their service. The first factor is the social code itself. For the women whose formation was most deeply rooted in the aristocratic world that the code governed, the question of leaving was not a question in the same way it was for women whose social formation did not include the code's requirements around loyalty and service and the maintenance of commitment once made. The code said that service was service, that you entered it, you committed to it, and you did not exit it because the service was difficult. Difficulty was not a reason. Difficulty was the condition, and the condition was what you had signed up for when you accepted the position, and the acceptance was understood as the acceptance of the full range of what the position contained. For women formed by this understanding, the experience of the working environment, the pattern, the directness, the absence of the accommodation that the pattern produced, was processed through the code's framework rather than through a framework that would have made the question of leaving a live question. The framework said, this is difficult. You absorb the difficult, you continue. The continuing is the form that loyalty takes. Loyalty is who you are. The code's framework is not a pathology. It is a genuine value system held by people who were formed by it and who understood the values it represented as real rather than as constraints imposed from outside. The loyalty it required was a form of commitment that the people inside the code valued in themselves and in each other, and the maintenance of the commitment in difficult conditions was understood as the expression of the value rather than the suppression of the person. But the code's framework, applied to the specific working environment of Anne's household, extracted a specific cost from the women who applied it. The cost was the cost of absorbing, across years of continued service, what the code required them to absorb without the outlet that the leaving would have provided. The staying was the code's answer to the difficulty. The cost of the staying was the accumulation of what the code required to be absorbed, the accumulation without the departure that would have ended it, the bearing without the boundary that the leaving would have constituted. The women who stayed longest paid the highest version of this cost, not because the longest service produced the most direct exposure to the pattern was consistent rather than escalating in its essential character, and the additional years of service added additional bearing rather than qualitatively different bearing, but because the accumulation across more years produced a more complete version of the specific damage that sustained exposure to the environment without relief produces in the person who sustains it. The second factor is the specific reward structure of the service. The women who stayed were not staying without return. The service provided specific things that the staying was in exchange for: the social standing, the access to the world of the institution and its events and its network of connections, the specific quality of a life that proximity to a senior royal provides in terms of the breadth and the variety and the occasional genuine interest of what the proximity makes available. The return was real. It was not equivalent to the cost. This account is not arguing that the service was a fair exchange for what the women who provided it were required to bear, but the return was real, and it was part of the calculation that produced the staying, alongside the code's requirements around loyalty and the specific factors that made leaving more costly than the civilian employment framework would have made it. The network of connections that the service provided was among the most significant of the returns. The women who served in Anne's household for sustained periods acquired, through the service, a network that extended into every corner of the specific world that Anne's public life touched: the equestrian world, the charitable world, the aristocratic and royal social world, the world of public institutions and formal gatherings that the Princess Royals program encompassed. The network was an asset, professional, social, practical, that the service created and that the continued service maintained and extended. The loss of the network was one of the costs that the leaving imposed. The departure from the service meant the departure from the network's most immediate and most active form, the direct access to the connections the service provided. The departure did not eliminate the network entirely, but it changed the character of the access from direct to second-hand, from current to historical, from the network of an active participant in the relevant world to the network of a former participant. The change was significant enough for women whose social and professional lives were substantially constituted by their participation in the relevant world to be a genuine cost of the departure. The women who stayed were partly staying to protect the network. Not cynically, not as a conscious calculation of costs and benefits in which the network was the explicit item being protected, but as one of the factors that made the staying feel like the rational choice alongside the code's requirements and the specific personal relationship with Anne that long service produced. The third factor is the personal relationship. This is the most complicated dimension of the staying, because the personal relationship that long service creates between a principal and her ladies-in-waiting is not a simple thing. It is not reducible to the working relationship and its specific character. It is also not separable from the working relationship in the way that personal relationships in civilian contexts can sometimes be separated from the professional dimensions of the connection. The women who stayed longest developed a relationship with Anne that had genuine personal dimensions alongside the professional ones. Anne's directness, the quality that in the household's working culture produced the pattern this account has described, also produced in the context of sustained personal relationship, a quality of engagement that some women found genuinely compelling. The directness in personal conversation could be the directness of someone who is actually present, actually attending, actually responding to the person she is talking to, rather than performing a social warmth she does not feel. The presence and the attention in a person of Anne's intelligence and range of knowledge could be the experience of being genuinely engaged with rather than managed. The women who experienced this dimension of Anne alongside the dimension this account has primarily described held a more complicated picture of their principle than the simpler accounts of the household's working culture would suggest. The complication is real, and this account acknowledges it. The same person can be the source of the genuine engagement and the source of the pattern. The complexity of the person does not cancel either dimension. What the complexity does do for the women who experienced both dimensions is produce the specific ambivalence about the service that the semi-public accounts from the longest-serving women consistently describe. The ambivalence is not confusion about what the service contained. It is the honest response of a person who has experienced two real things simultaneously and who has found that neither fully cancels the other. The staying for these women was the staying of people who were inside a complicated relationship, not a simple relationship between a victim and a perpetrator, not a simple relationship between a loyal servant and an honorable principal, but the complicated relationship between two people who had been in sustained close proximity across years, and who had each in that proximity come to know something real about the other that the simpler account did not capture. The complication is part of the full picture. This account has focused on the dimension of the picture that the official account omits. The official account focuses on the dimension this account has been necessary to address. The full picture contains both, and the women who stayed longest were the women for whom the full picture, the complicated both-dimensional picture, was most present in the daily experience of the service. They stayed, the staying cost them. The cost was different from the cost of the leaving. It was the cost of absorption rather than the cost of departure, the cost of continued bearing rather than the cost of the managed exit. But it was real, and it was borne across years by women who had concluded for reasons that were their own and that this account has attempted to describe, that the staying was what the code and the relationship and the calculation of what they had and what the leaving would cost them required. The ones who stayed are as much a part of this account as the ones who left. Their staying is not evidence that the pattern was less real than the departures suggest. It is evidence of the complexity of the responses that real people make to real situations, the multiple factors that shape whether a person remains or leaves, the multiple costs that different choices produce, the multiple ways that the same working environment can be experienced by different people with different formations and different resources and different relationships to what the service provided and required. The ones who stayed are not the institution's evidence that the pattern was acceptable. They are the evidence that acceptable is not the same as survivable. People survive many things that are not acceptable. The survival does not make the thing acceptable. The staying does not make the pattern something other than what the word describes. It makes the women who stayed something more complicated than victims and something more complicated than the institution's evidence that the service was fine. They are people who made a specific choice in specific circumstances and who bore the specific cost of the choice they made. Like the women who left, they deserve the visibility that the Crown's silence was purchased to prevent. Like the women who left, they are in this account. They are not managed out of it. They remain, as they. What the early household established in its initial years was the working culture that would persist and intensify across the decades of the household's operation. The working culture had the specific character that Philip's formation had produced in Anne, demanding in its expectations, direct in its communication, not particularly patient with the failure to meet the expectations or the discomfort that the directness produced in the people it was directed toward. The directness was experienced differently by different women in the early household, depending on their specific temperament and their specific relationship to the social code that governed the world they all shared. Some women, formed by the same code and sharing the same values around self-sufficiency and the acceptance of high standards without complaint, absorbed the directness as the normal working condition of a demanding employer and continued in their service without particular difficulty. These women are part of the story too. Their presence in the household across sustained periods is part of the evidence that the atmosphere was not universally and uniformly damaging, that the specific women who bore the worst of what the word describes were not random but were somehow specifically in the line of the expression. Other women experienced the directness differently. The women who needed more accommodation than the formation produced, who were more sensitive to the specific quality of the communication in ways that the formation did not value or provide for, who found the working culture of the household more costly to sustain than the social code permitted them to acknowledge, these women began to leave in the early years with a frequency that the household's small size and the aristocratic social world's discretion kept below the threshold of notice that would have generated external attention. The frequency of departures is the first visible sign of the pattern. In a household of the size and the type that Anne's early household represented, staff turnover at the level of the senior positions, the ladies-in-waiting, the private secretaries, is expected to be low. These are positions occupied by women who have been selected for their suitability, who have undergone the institutional assessment that the palace applies to appointments at this level, and who have committed to a form of service that is understood as sustained rather than temporary. A high rate of departure from these positions in any royal household is the kind of pattern that generates attention in the world of royal service, the world of private secretaries and courtiers, and the network of people whose professional lives involve proximity to the royal family, and who carry, in that proximity, detailed knowledge of the specific atmosphere of each of the households they have contact with. The attention was generated, not publicly. The world of royal service is not a world in which attention to institutional problems produces public statements or press coverage. The attention was internal, carried in the private knowledge of the people whose professional world included awareness of Anne's household, expressed in the oblique language of a world that knows what it knows and says it in terms that maintain plausible deniability while communicating the substance to people with sufficient context to receive it. The attention did not produce into. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.